Hi, my name is Alon Rosen. I'm a professor of computer science at the Herzliya Interdisciplinary Center in Israel. Today is the 23rd of November, 2017, and I'm here in Rehovot at the Weizmann Institute of Science, together with Shafi Goldwasser, who is being interviewed as part of the ACM Turing Award Winners Project. Hi, Shafi. We are here to conduct an interview about your life, about your achievements. We will go chronologically, generally speaking, chronologically, and we will talk at two levels. The first level will be a general audience type of level, and the second level will be more specific, more oriented towards people that are specialized in the subject and are interested in the details. Let's begin. So, could you give us some family background? I'd be interested in your parents, where they came from, what they did, and maybe your earliest memories.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Alon, for taking this opportunity to interview me. My family background. So I was born in New York, actually, in Seagate, which is right outside New York City. And it's sort of a beach community. And we were a family of four. I have an older brother who was 6 years older than me. And my parents were Israelis who were actually visiting the United States for a period of time. My father was representing the Israel Kupat Cholim, which is the health services at the time. He was recruiting doctors, recruiting donations, buying equipment for the Israeli medical services we were just starting. And my earliest memories, it's a good question. I think I remember something about going to the beach in Seagate, which is where we lived, because my mother used to take us to the beach every day. And I remember there's a lot of wind on the beach, and I remember sort of one of my balloons, or maybe it was a floaty or some sort, sort of flying away. But it's not very relevant to my career going forward, except I've always liked the beach, and that might be related. And my mother was a homemaker. The background of my family is that my father was born in Poland before the war. And he, when the war broke out, World War II, he was a law student in Krakow. And, but as the war broke out, he came back home to where his family was, which is in Bielsko, is a town in Poland, not far from Auschwitz, actually, between, he, with some other young Jewish men, which were around, I think, 19 or something like that, 19 years old, they escaped to Russia. And from one thing to the other, he was in Russia, he was in Siberia. Somehow he joined these units of the Polish army that joined the Allies to fight the Germans. And through a very roundabout way, at some point they landed in Israel, and he stayed in Israel. And when he stayed in Israel, he was without anything. His family he had no idea where they were. He thought they all perished. It turned out they didn't all, some of them did. But his mother and his sister actually survived the war. They were in camps, but later he thought his mother was dead. But after the war, he wrote a letter to a neighbor, and the neighbor said that his mother is living next door. So we went back around 1947, 1948, and he eventually brought her back to Israel. But he met my mother during those years, and my mother's a completely different story. Her parents came to Israel in the 30s, and they were some of the people who founded a town in Israel, or a farming community called Kfar Vitkin, and she was born in Israel. And they met because he rented a room in their house, and she was giving him Hebrew lessons. So she was away actually in school, and she would come back in vacations, and she was giving Hebrew lessons. And she always told the story that all of a sudden this very strange man from Poland, who didn't know Hebrew and had very kind of polite mannerisms, asked her, "Would you marry me?" And she was like, "No, like, who are you?" But apparently he was very charming. But in any case, those are my parents. And I also have a younger sister. She was born years later after we came back to Israel.
And did you come back, where did you come back to in Israel?
So we came back to Israel when I was 6. We came back to Tel Aviv. So we came back straight from New York to Tel Aviv.
And where did you live in Tel Aviv specifically?
In Tel Aviv I lived It's near a place called Kikar Hamdina. You know, it's at the time was considered sort of the north part of Israel. I think now it's called the Old North.
Of Tel Aviv.
Of Tel Aviv, not of Israel, of Tel Aviv. Yeah.
I have a question actually about your father's childhood. I heard a story that he was studied with the Pope or something, with John Paul.
Yes, that's right. So Bielsko is actually part of two towns called Bielsko, Biala. And there's a sort of river that runs between Bielsko and Biala, and the Pope was from there. I think maybe he's from Biala and my father's from Bielsko, and they were in the same high school. And my father always said that he knew the Pope, and you know, this sounded like some of these stories which
you don't believe.
which sounds like fantasies, but it actually turns out that then I met people who went with my father to high school, and they were actually in Italy, because they ended up, after the war, they stayed in Italy, and they would see the Pope regularly, because they were part of an
and
acquaintances
he got to meet him
group.
again, or?
My father? I don't think so, because he didn't really go back to Poland for many years. No, I don't think so. They were not close friends. They were in the same high school, and they knew of each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the thread to
Yeah.
Tel Aviv. So
Yeah.
you came back to Tel Aviv after kindergarten in
Right. So
the
I was in the U.S. till age 6, and I went to kindergarten, to this kindergarten called Bialik School. There was a Bialik school, and they had a kindergarten, and that's another memory that I remember from New York. There was a kindergarten in the playground. It was on the roof. You know, like there were slides and a sandbox, I think. And I remember you would sleep in the afternoon there. There was a big room with mats on the floor. In any case, we came back to Israel when I was around 5.5 or 6, and I came to first grade to this school called Ade Gordon, which still exists in Tel Aviv.
It's a famous school.
It's a famous school, right? It's sort of a proletarian school. And I came not exactly mid-year, but a few months into the beginning of the year. And I think that for the rest of my duration of school, which is 8 years, and even today, they remembered me as the girl who came from America, which shows to you how Israel was at that time, that was such a rare occurrence. And because I didn't know Hebrew for the first few weeks, I think they sort of remembered me as someone who didn't know how to speak Hebrew in the beginning.
Do you remember any specific day or any specific event from the return, from the time of return? Your first day, for instance, but not necessarily.
At school?
Yeah, not necessarily.
No, I remember actually some funny event, which is unrelated to the Turing history for sure. But then my parents were renovating this apartment in Tel Aviv, which actually my parents lived through the rest of their lives, and I actually own it now. And while they were renovating, I was staying with my grandmother in Kfar Vitkin, and I was very attached to my mother. And she had to go to Tel Aviv to, I don't know, to supervise the renovation, and she couldn't get away from me, so she locked me in the bathroom. That I remember. That, yeah. This is not representative. She was actually a very good mother.
But it's representative of the era, of the time.
Yes.
Okay, so we're back to Gordon Elementary School, and then middle school, I assume, if it was...
well, in Israel, it's like 1 to 8, yeah.
1 to 8. You said it was a proletary kind of school?
It's sort of, the school was unusual for Israel at the time. I actually don't know really if it's unusual at this point. I think it is. Like, for example, we ate there, you know, there was a lunch, and there was a very, very big room with long tables where there's probably 12 or more kids per table. And before we would eat lunch, there would be news that were being recited, and then we would sing some songs, and then we would eat. And I kind of hated the food, I remember that, especially the oatmeal or daisa that they would make. And I remember that one day they wanted me to stay and eat everything, right? Because you're supposed to kind of clean your plate, especially at that time, I think, in Israel. And my mother happened to pass by, and she told the teacher that I don't have to eat whatever. There's no need to force me to eat anything. That was, again, another very strong protective memory of my mother, that I knew that I could really do whatever I want, which was always true.
And, okay. About the atmosphere. I'm curious about the atmosphere in the school and how you related to it.
Yeah, the atmosphere at school, it was very, sort of, very Israeli, very rooted in Israeli culture. It's a school that I think a lot of sort of famous figures from Israel history went to, you know, Yitzhak Rabin and some other famous people. And in fact, it wasn't near home, so I had to take a bus to go to school, which was an unusual thing in Israel. But my parents heard about the school. They asked before they came back, which school should they send Shafi to? And they said this particular school, because this is school from Tnuat Avoda, whatever, particular political party, the ruling party of the day, and that it's long hours and it's good education and good fundamentals. In any case, so I went to this school. So I took this bus number 5 every day to school and back. And except in the morning, my parents used to go to the beach every day in Tel Aviv, because my father loved swimming, and so did my mother, since she grew up in Kfar Vitkin, which was near the beach. And we used to go every day, 6 o'clock in the morning. We would take the Dodge Dart, which we brought from New York, and drive to the beach. And I'm mentioning Dodge Dart not because it's such a fantastic car, but at that time in Israel they didn't exist. And I remember that there's another memory that in the United States we had this car, and it was just a small car. And then it arrived, you know, on ship to Israel, and it was huge. It was like the biggest car ever in the streets, you know, and we had this car for a very long time. We used to go to the beach every day in the morning, and then they would take me to school.
And did you feel that you belonged in the atmosphere of the northern Tel Aviv at that period, or were you
Northern Tel Aviv was very laid back at that period. You know, it's not, I don't think it's what people think of today. Yeah, you know, I remember there were these 2 kids in the building that I used to play with. They didn't go to the same school because the school was far away, so I rarely saw the kids that I went to school with. But the atmosphere was very, it was a much smaller town. It certainly was not the lively of Tel Aviv that people think of today. The school, as I said, there were a lot of singing, you know. Sunday morning, there was an hour of singing, all kinds of songs, you know, these sort of Russian melodies, but Hebrew words. They're celebrating all the holidays. There are a lot of Israeli holidays, as you know. And then in terms of schooling, you know, I loved literature. I loved a sort of history and stories of the Bible.
Do you remember specifics about which literature?
Which literature?
And which stories in the Bible?
From the Bible. I just want to explain the stories from the Bible are not religious stories. So in Israel, you learn sort of stories in the Bible sort of from first grade on, and it's always at least at the school that I went to, it's really stories. So there's a narrative about characters that you get attached to. At least I did. I've always liked to read. Do I remember specific stories?
Which are the
Yael in Sisra.
Yeah,
I remember that. So there's a story of Yael, who was someone who helped the Israelites, and there was this conqueror or fighter, or I don't know exactly the name in English. I would know how to call that in Hebrew. And he was tired, and he came to rest at her tent. And he asked her for water, and she gave him milk, and then she killed him. This is all in order to protect the Israelites. And then because she was part of this pacifist tribe, she was then punished by her tribe for this for this murder. But she was hailed as a, you know, big protector of the Jewish people.
Interesting.
She was a strong woman.
Okay. What about literature?
If I remember something specific, actually I can't remember right now.
Okay.
But I do remember that I wanted to be a writer. And me and a friend, and I, we decided to write a newspaper. So we organized this little newspaper with stories, and we said we were going to charge kids 2 cents or 2 grosh in Israeli. And I think that we had a third friend that she bought one of the copies. That was it. There was 1 copy, there was 1 customer. It's a very short-lived experience.
What about friends? Do you have any particular people you remember from the period?
Yeah, I remember I had a lot of girlfriends.
Can you mention them?
Yeah. There was this girl called Racheli Ben David that her father worked in the city hall, and he had an office at the top floor in the city hall, which is in Kikar Rabin now. And we used to throw things. I used to go there and visit Fridays at the end of school, and we used to throw things from the top floor. I mean, I don't know, things, like paper planes. Then there was Maya Galperin. She was another friend that I kept in touch with for many years. So those are the people that I remember. There were a few others.
And are you still in touch with them?
I lost touch for many years. And then I reconnected with Maya, for example, years later, because she went to high school as well with me. But I didn't keep close friends from that period, from an elementary school. Okay.
And can you tell us a bit more about your relationship with your siblings?
So I have one brother who's 6 years older than me, Nati. And then I have a sister who was 11 years younger than me. I remember when she was born. I was in 6th grade or something like that. My parents went away for vacation, and 9 months later she was born. In fact, I remember that I made a deal with them that I really wanted a dog. And they said that a dog I won't get. So then I said, okay, so either a dog or a sister, and we wrote this contract. And I have it actually. I found it a few years ago when I was cleaning my parents' apartment. In any case, I got a sister. I have a dog now, but not then. Yeah, it was very, we were lived in this apartment, which seemed to be plenty big, but in the standards today is quite small. And we, again, used to go to the beach. And my little sister, I felt very protective of her. I remember taking her to daycare in the mornings. And when my mother would take her, she wouldn't let my mother go away. But when I took her, I would just put her there and go to school. This is already high school.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else that you would like to tell us about
yeah, I guess
from that
so.
period?
I mean, just one thing is that my grandparents, from my mother's side, so as I told you, my father had a mother and a sister who went through the war and then arrived in Israel. Some interesting story also somehow, like they brought the son of the sister sort of illegally into Israel because otherwise the grandmother wasn't willing to come. But my grandparents from the other side, from my mother's side, they lived in Kfar-Vitkin. They had an agricultural farm or unit. They had cows and chickens, and I had cousins there, and we would spend every weekend, we would go there for spending time with them, having lunch, going to the beach. Sometimes I would spend weeks there in the summer. So this connection with this farming place, or moshav, is very strong in my mind. That is really childhood.
Mm-hmm.
That
so
and the beach.
There's a bit of contrast between the urban Tel Aviv, that is bourgeois, and the working, agricultural working part.
Right, although I don't think really my upbringing in Tel Aviv could be described as bourgeois. Even though, because of the school that I went to, and because of my mother coming from this moshav, she really was not, she was not a bourgeois type. She didn't take care of herself so much. The house was, very casual, shall I say. It wasn't a very formal atmosphere, and it wasn't a very fancy atmosphere. So it's hard to...
But you didn't feel like an outsider in Tel Aviv, for instance?
No.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on.
Okay.
High school?
High school, right. So then high school, it was already a different story. I went to a high school that was next door, it was Tichon Daled, and so I didn't have to take the bus anymore. And all my friends from elementary school, they went to different high schools, Tichon Hey, because they were from the neighborhood near the elementary school. So it was just me and another girl, Maya, and maybe one other, that went to this new school. And those years I remember quite vividly. The orientation changed a bit for me, from sort of being interested in the sort of more humanity subjects to more the mathematical subjects. Mathematics, the science. I remember I loved physics. I didn't really like life sciences, but physics and math I liked quite a bit. And I had a great teacher, it's Uri, from 11th and 12th grade. And somehow I did well, and I think that was part of why I wanted to do it. And I had another teacher for physics. His name was Zelikovic, and physics in my mind was just fantastic. Things made sense. You could derive things. I think early on, that's what I wanted to study.
What about mathematics?
In mathematics, again, I was good at it. But mathematics itself, at that time, was not described as mathematics with sort of motivation. It was more the method, taking derivatives, integrals, and I was, in trigonometry and all that, and I could perform it well, but it didn't have the stories associated with them that physics did.
So it was more about technique, less
about technique rather than about motivation.
And did you already then have a sense that you missed the concepts and?
I had no idea that there were concepts. All I knew that I liked the concepts in physics. The whole derivation from principles was beautiful in my eyes. And I remember questions on the exam, and then you would have to think, and I have the impression of some memory where my answer was different than others, and he was surprised, the professor. But I cannot, for the life of me, remember what the question was or what the derivation was.
So it sort of sounds like this professor was, he had an encouraging influence on you.
Yes, both of them. Yes.
These are two different people.
Yes, Uri was the math professor and Zalikovic was the physics professor.
Okay. And how significant do you think it is?
To have a good professor? To have someone who influences you that early?
Yes.
Extremely significant. I think if you're very lucky, there's someone early on, and that could be high school, could be maybe college, but better in high school, that awakens something in you, that somehow a spark, an interest, so that maybe later you're not going to do exactly that, but there's something about studying and about pursuing knowledge that is exciting. I think it's fundamental, and I don't think that it has to be more than one. I had other good teachers there, the literature, I remember the teacher, the history teacher. I remember learning Shakespeare in English class. But something about, there was some spark there in the science classes and in the math classes that I recall.
So by then your self-image was sort of that you were set towards studying scientifically oriented subject?
No, not at all. Okay. As I said to you, I love to write, and I think that my inner image was that I was going to be a writer. But I guess you're right. By the time we got to the 11th and 12th grade, my parents, or especially my father, was very kind of insistent that I should follow the realistic, is this what we call it in Hebrew, realistic studies, or mathematics and physics studies. Because as people of his generation, and maybe people of the current generation in Israel as well, there's a real emphasis on pragmatism and the exact sciences, and that everything else is a bit less, it's fun, it might be enjoyable, but it's not as real as what one must do in life. And
what do you think about this Israeli tendency?
What do I think about this Israeli tendency? It's a good question, right? On one hand, you can't argue with success. I mean, Israel is doing very well. This whole idea of a startup nation, it's not a phrase, it's the truth. You see the talent that's coming out of here, you see the ideas that come out of here, the technology, how we are able to compete with the rest of the world. And I think part of it is this drive to go into science, go into technology, excel at it. So can't argue with success. On the other hand, there's a lot of art that has developed here over the years. Art, writings. When I was little, that was not as developed. Even the whole culinary style that exists in Tel Aviv. The whole idea of having a good life meaning that is composed of art, and music, and film, and food, and that was not part of how I grew up, in the sense of importance. But it is the part of Israel today. So what do I think about it? I think that it would be better if there was importance, a stated importance on humanities, philosophy and art and literature. It exists, but I think that in the scheme of things, people seem to have more respect for studying exact sciences. Certainly in high school is the case. So when my kids were studying in high school here, it was very clear that, the kids who were studying math and science are better thought of. I think that may change later, but it was the feeling I got when watching my kids and their friends.
You seem to have suggested that it's been changing a bit in Israel.
No, I'm saying that there's also a whole other subculture that pays attention to film and all these other fields, which I've mentioned. But it belongs in pockets, I don't think it's infiltrated in everywhere. So it's still like I was when I was growing up, but perhaps not completely. I really can't speak in such authority about Israel because I left Israel when I was 17 and a half, and then I spent most of my life, or at least half of my life, in the States. So I would hate to come across as a figure that speaks with authority about what Israel is like today.
Yes, but you do have perspective.
I do have perspective.
And from the distance, it's actually beneficial.
From inside and outside, it's kind of coming and going.
Yes.
I've done a lot of coming and going.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later. Up until now, you were talking about, for the most part, about your personal experiences and chain of events. And I'd be interested to hear now about your view on the global experience of Israel at the time.
Sure. Yeah, I do have the tendency to talk about the personal stuff. Well, it's what I know best. But let me tell you a little bit about my memories about Israel. So first of all, I lived here through a few wars, right? There was, I remember the 6 Days War. I think I was in 6th grade. No, 4th grade. 4th grade?
Yes.
Yes, 4th grade. I remember that. And I remember we went down to the bunker, to the miklat. And I remember the sirens. And I remember right after the war, my family and we drove to Jerusalem. And I remember still seeing the Wailing Wall before they kind of opened up the big, how do you say it?
Rachava.
Achava. But how do you say it in English?
The big square.
The big square in front of it, there was this kind of a narrow street. I remember going there and seeing it. And I remember actually going to Jerusalem before that and seeing where the border with Jordan was, and there was like the Jordanian soldiers, and then that was gone, right? And there was just the wall, and we were walking all around Jerusalem. There was somewhat of an euphoria. Who knew that this would be, as we say in Hebrew, b'chia ledorot. In any case, I remember that. Another thing I remember about the war is that it was a friend of mine who lived in the same building. Her name was Karina. And her parents sent her when the war broke out because she had relatives that said that they must send her. And after she came back, I was telling her about the war, about sitting in the bunker, about what it was like. And she said, "Oh, it sounds like so great. I wish there was a war right now." I remember even as a child, it sounded like a funny thing to me. But in any case, this is 4th grade. And then I remember Yom Kippur War. So Yom Kippur War is a different story. Then I'm already in 10th grade, I think, and my brother was a soldier, and I remember it was Yom Kippur, and this was the first Yom Kippur ever that I was going to fast. And me and I think the same Karina, we decided we're going to fast together, and we walked around near the Yarkon, which is sort of a river that runs through Tel Aviv. And when we came back, we saw lots of cars. It was like about 1 o'clock or something like that, or 12 o'clock. Lots of cars driving, and it's very typical for Yom Kippur. And when I came home, my brother was there, because he was in the army, but he came home for Yom Kippur, and he told us that there's going to be a war. In fact, maybe the hours are being mixed up a little bit. Maybe he said it earlier. In any case, he said there's going to be a war, and my father said to him, "What are you speaking nonsense for?" It was like, because, Jews that came, I think, from the war, another war, the whole idea of talking about death and war was something that you just don't talk about it because it's just bad luck, or you just don't say things like that. And then he was called, and he left, right, because he had to go back to the army. And then we didn't see him for a few weeks.
Why did he serve?
He was in during his military service, at that point, he was actually in some sort of a intelligence a unit, but his intelligence unit joined Katyushot, which are these artilleries, and they kept on going from the north, from the Golan Heights to the south, to the Sinai, back and forth, back and forth. And I remember the first phone call that he called, and my father asked him how was his commander, who was someone that my father felt was going to protect him. And he said, he's no longer. And I remember my father just burst out crying. He was just so worried about him.
How did you feel about?
You know, I remember in school we did these things. We filled sacks of sand, you know, for these trenches. We went to a place where we packed food for soldiers. I think it was for soldiers, or for, in the case of some sort of evacuation, the people will have these bagged foods. It's a very confused time, right? Especially you're worried about your brother, what's going to happen with him. And then I remember when he came back home the first time, I don't know how long it was really, because he stayed in the army for about 6 months afterwards. He was supposed to be released, but he stayed longer because of the war. But I remember that he had a lot less hair. So he had like these two sides of his, you know, his forehead, his hair receded quite a bit. It was amazing that this kind of traumatic experience can do that. So he went with full head of hair, and this was, and it receded.
And at the time, okay, I was asking more, how did you feel about your father crying?
Oh, about my father crying. It was a little scary. He just kind of lost control, you know, because he wasn't a crying man.
Do you think any of this had any effect on you in the long term, on
think
your
it had-
personality, outlook?
I think it had an effect on my father. I think that when my brother came back from the army, he joined the Hebrew University. He went to, because he was going to go and study mathematics, and he went right away. They postponed the semester because of all these soldiers. They started a new semester in January, like a new school year. But my father just wanted him out of Israel as fast as possible. He was so afraid for his safety that he wanted him to go to school in the States. And within a year, like the second year, he somehow arranged, he kind of made him apply abroad, and he got accepted to Carnegie Mellon, and he left. And that affected me because that started some sort of chain reaction in the family.
And okay, you said your brother wanted to study mathematics.
My brother...
What did he end up doing?
He studied mathematics as his first degree, and then he went to business school at Carnegie Mellon. It's called GSIA, Graduate School of Industrial Administration. And then he went to work. And when I arrived to age, I had like a year or so before my military service, and my father wanted me to go to the US to study so that I don't waste any time. This idea of wasting time is something very problematic, or was very problematic when I was growing up. Now it seems like everybody's just taking trips around the world as soon as they finish the army, before the army, and wasting time is not called wasting time anymore, but gaining life experience. In any case, my father wanted me to go to the States, and as usual, I did what he recommended, and went to Carnegie Mellon, and I went to study mathematics.
I'm curious. So you say your father recommended and said, did your mother have any say, any influence about your decisions?
I think she agreed with him. I don't think she was, you know, she was dominant in the sense that I remember her there all the time. She was extremely, you know, I remember her cooking, and I remember her doing homework with me, and she was very much into the humanistic subjects, right? So I remember reading with her and talking about these biblical stories and history, but in terms of these decisions, I think she just kind of agreed with him or didn't object to him. And she also did say to us, both to me and my sister, throughout growing up, is that a woman has to take care of herself and she has to be independent. It's extremely important. And I think that probably was because she wasn't, right? My father was the one who was the breadwinner. And I think in her mind, you know, anything that was a step toward accomplishing that was a good step. And I don't think she thought about the fact that that meant that I was going away, or if she did think about it, she thought it was worth it.
Any other anecdotes from the childhood period in Israel relating to your view of the era?
Well, you know, my high school, no, not my high school, my elementary school was near Sderot Ben Gurion, and Ben Gurion's house was very close by, and we used to go by there and see the guard. So I remember that Ben Gurion was a big figure, was a big looming figure. This whole idea of him being in the house or being in the desert, you know, his whole view of the desert and the importance of populating it. And then another maybe anecdote that has to do with the Israeli scene at the time, and not a you know, personal scene, but not to do with the wars, is when, this is the 60s, when the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Eshkol, died. I somehow remember that they told this to us and in school, and there was such mourning, you know, all the kids burst out crying, like why would they? I mean, but there was such a feeling that you were a member of a global tribe or a local tribe, and even that infiltrated all the way down to sort of young children who felt connected and felt that they knew who this man was. Now it could be because of the school that I went to, that all of them, you know, were kids of families from the Labor Party, or what's called Labor Party now, and then I think it was Mapai. And also I grew up in this kind of a home. So these are sort of memories about these figures bigger than life, you know, Ben Gurion and Eshkol. And I remember that we read newspapers feverishly every day, you know, 3 newspapers from cover to cover. And I had tremendously strong opinions about Israeli politics, what's right and what's wrong. Like one of the discussions I remember we always had was whether the Jews in Europe were the same as the Jews in Israel. You know, whether they were, you know, whether we should be ashamed there's this Israeli sentence, Latzon Latevach, that they went into these camps as sheep and they didn't resist. This was a big myth in Israel. And I was always very much against it. And I was a very singular voice in my class. I remember we had these debates where a lot of the kids were like, you know, we're not like them. And to me, it was sort of obvious that we are exactly like them, and that who can judge people in that situation, you know, after being starved for years. So I remember these kind of political debates. We had many of them, and I had lots of very strong opinions about this. Then I remember also the first terrorist attack in Ma'alot, where there was a school trip, and the school was, while the kids were sleeping there was a terrorist attack from the north. And you know, it was so real, it was so vivid, it was so part of our lives, you know, like we would know blow by blow. Of course it was, you know, overdone, because, you know, they would describe everything in such graphical, yellow journalistic details. But one must forgive it, because it was the first time. And I think it was a shock to such a young country that didn't realize what it was doing. And as kids, these are extremely, you know, powerful and somewhat traumatic images to think of other kids and what's happening to them. And then there was the whole debate about teachers. Did they stay in the school? Didn't they stay in the school? Did they protect the children? And again, my view was, you know, there was the judgmental view, which is you must protect the children because you are the teacher. And then there's the view that they're people and they also have, you know, families and kind of impulses that they cannot control of protecting themselves. And I think that in that situation, my opinion was that they should have stayed. So there was some moralistic line in my judgmental opinions about these events.
So you describe it in hindsight a bit with a cynical point of view, but how was it back then?
What do you mean?
How did you perceive all the events? Did you have a cynical outlook already as a kid?
No, not at all. My father was a big cynic, but not about things like that, right? But certainly cynicism and humor and seeing things in somewhat of a perspective, which is, you know, there's the big picture, but there's reality, is something I got from home. But I think at that time, you know, as a kid, I was resistant to that. It was like, it was very annoying to me that my father was cynical. And now, as to be expected, I am cynical myself.
And do you feel there was a period where you had a transition from the innocent view of a child to...
No, I think it just happens with age, doesn't it?
With age over time?
Yeah.
Because you did describe that you had a contrary view to your peers.
Yeah. So I certainly
So
think
it's
that
an
I've always
indication.
had my opinions, and I've always thought about things in my own way. I mean, I don't know if it has anything to do with the fact that later on I went on to be sort of a scientist or someone who invented things, but I always remember this thing about crossing the street and how people usually cross the street together, you know, when the lights turn green, and that I would always cross the street either before or after, and it always would be surprising to me that people would wait for other people to cross the street.
Do you have any other anecdotes?
Of that sort?
Of that sort?
You know, no, I think these political debates, is this crossing the street, it's this, I can't think of another episode, but I must say that home was very supportive of this. So my father was not a usual man. He did not have typical opinions. I've described him so far as sort of an outcome of his generation, you know, that he was pragmatic, but he had very unusual opinions. The fact that he wanted me to study, he wanted me to go abroad, you know, there was no difference between men and women here, and he thought we could do anything. That was very unusual. And that was true all along. You know, this whole idea that women should behave a certain way, they should get married, they should have families, that was completely beside the point for him. So, and he was very vocal about that. And, you know, he thought I was, you know, bigger than life. You know, and that was a good thing to grow up with, having that image of yourself, you know.
So you already grew up with this feeling that you have the capacity and empowerment.
Yeah, you know, life certainly kind of beats it out of you. But certainly as a child, that was a very important sense that my parents gave me.
So from both parents? It came from both parents?
Well, my mother was just a very loving mother. So she was there, you know, she was, I think she gave us a lot of love. I mean, my father gave this feeling of power.
And in school? How was the...
You know, I was a good student, right? I was a good student always. So, and I felt that the teachers respected me, those who did respect me. So there was no contradiction to that.
So for you personally not, but there's this talk that women are, society is directing women, driving them away from...
Right, there is such talk. I certainly didn't fail in elementary school. In fact, nobody says that's true about elementary school. They usually say that starts in high school. In high school, I had one math professor in early, 5th grade or 6th grade, that's 9th grade, 9th or 10th grade, who was not appreciative of me, and kind of said that I shouldn't go and study.
And you think it's because you were
a woman?
A woman, and still are.
Yeah, I think he was like a chauvinist pig.
Okay, and do you think, like, what is your opinion on the other women, the other girls in high school? They may have had a different experience than yours, or do you think there was something in Israel society that was, at the time?
No, I think there were some girls who were really good at math and science. I think there were like, there was some girl who skipped the class. There were a few, we weren't, many of us, you know, when we went into the specializations. So there was a class that specialized in math and science, math and physics. There were a few girls, not too many. And, but they were very strong. So the ones who were there were very strong.
And do you remember somebody in particular that went on and made a career in a related field?
The truth is that I don't know, I didn't follow them.
Okay, before we move on,
yes.
Any other figures from high school, friends, people that...
influenced me?
You remember, influenced you, anecdotal stories?
There are a few guy friends who went with me to high school who are now sort of well-known computer scientists.
For instance?
Yossi Matias, I think he's head of Google Israel. Udi Rivlin, who's a professor in the Technion in computer vision. And we were classmates, yeah. So, but not only classmates, we were friends, we knew each other.
So in the context of computer science, any other prominent computer scientists?
From that time?
From the school?
From the school, so I think that Adi Shamir actually went to that school, but he's older than me, so he went there a few years before. And I think that Tzvika Galil, who's now the head of School of Computing in Georgia Tech, he also went to that school, but again, a different period. But they all had the same math teacher, this Uri. that I mentioned earlier.
I see. So they also remember? Did you?
Yes, yes, everybody remembers.
Everybody remembers?
Oh, yeah, he's his character.
So it's safe to say that there was some influential figure there that groomed the... So now, US.
Yes. Okay, so I arrived to the US. It's 1976. It's actually the Entebbe. As I landed in the US, it was really that day. And big excitement because, you know, the Israelis saved the day. I mean, they saved almost everyone. This is what... and I landed in the US. There's, you know, Israel is like loved by everyone. I remember there was this beauty queen. I was selected, the first Israeli beauty queen became Miss Universe, Rina Mo, right? But, you know, in general, 76 was a year of great admiration of Israel. I land in the US, and my brother comes and picks me up in New York. And we spend a few days in New York, and then we take a bus to Pittsburgh, from New York to Pittsburgh. And, you know, new world. I knew nothing about Pittsburgh. I spent the summer in the dorms, you know, waiting for the school year to start. I actually never applied to the school. It's just my brother told his professors that his sister is coming for a year and she's good at math. And since he was good at math and they knew that he was a talent, they said, does she want to come and study here? And he said yes, and they said okay. That was it. I became an undergraduate in mathematics, in applied mathematics. Then it was applied mathematics and computer science. Now there's a computer science department, undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon. At the time there wasn't. And the truth is that I actually loved studying. This was a revelation. You know, when you go to high school, you sort of do what you're told, right? But I found it really interesting. I found the math interesting. I found the computer science interesting. I took this introduction class in Fortran programming. In the beginning, I had no idea. There were these cards where you put an instruction on every card and it goes through a machine and then it executes each instruction. I've never seen a computer before. I haven't really heard about computers before, but it was fascinating. It was really marvelous.
Okay, I have two questions now.
Yeah.
So I'm debating with myself about the admissions. You said the admissions process was unorthodox in your case, and I want to ask.
I would say.
No, I want to ask what would have happened today with admissions.
Today, you know that the whole college admissions in the U.S. is something bordering on insane. You know, there are standardized tests, there's grades, there's extracurricular activities, there are huge committees that sit and deal with every case. You know, they accept legacy and people with, you know, talents that supplement whatever the needs of the school are, and who knows what else. And there's also a big mystery about this. All, in my opinion, geared toward, you know, making money on the admissions process. So, is the outcome any better? I believe serendipity is a big part of one's life trajectory. And, you know, maybe some of the serendipity is lost with this whole process that's very meticulous. But they're talking these days about having machine learning take over the admissions process. And so we are in for a whole new era, if that's going to be the case.
Do you have any prediction where this may go, like specifically?
I think it's the usual thing, right? When you start with a new technology, whatever it is, and in this case we're talking about something what is very disruptive, right? We're going to have a machine that has access to a lot of data of the past, decide who will be a good student, who will not be a good student, who's a match for Carnegie Mellon versus a match for Berkeley versus a match for MIT and Harvard and so forth. My prediction is that in the short term, there will be a lot of mistakes till we understand what is being done. And hopefully, if we are cautious enough and smart enough, we're going to be able to mitigate these mistakes in time so as to incorporate the things we really want before we sort of jump ahead and just kind of blindly let these algorithms make decisions that right now are done by individuals. Having said that, it's not that what's done by individuals is so perfect. So it's very hard to tell whether you are just actually doing better because now you're treating this whole problem in a formal way, or you're doing worse because you are taking the human element out. But these are fantastic research problems.
You have a personal connection to this kind of research problem?
Yeah, because my son is interested in it.
You want to tell us about this now, or we can talk about it later?
We can talk about it later.
Okay, so I'll
Yeah,
keep
but
a
my
note.
older son, Yonadav, is very interested in these topics of sort of policy, society, and machine learning. He sort of started from the machine learning, kind of very hard science, and then he got interested in how to incorporate into them without sacrificing performance and utility, also these concerns that have to do with impact on the world.
Okay, so maybe we'll get back to
Maybe.
it later. Okay, undergrad years.
Right, so undergrad years, I'm in Carnegie Mellon. I started in mathematics. There is this even program called Math Studies, which only few kids go to, where there are these two professors who teach a handful of kids. And it's supposed to go through all mathematics, you know, topology, geometry, algebra, of course, and everything in 2 years, logic. And they spend essentially the first semester arguing with each other how to define each concept. Definienda, definiendum, back and forth, back and forth. It's abstract beyond anything that I've ever seen, because in Israeli high school, you know, things are very method oriented, right? They're teaching you how to perform, how to solve exercises. They don't really teach you, at least at that time, they didn't teach you about the concept of a limit, or why are you taking derivatives and why are you integrating. And here we're completely, it's all axiomatic. So I go through this semester, or maybe a year, and the whole thing is a 2-year program, and after a year I quit. And I think to myself, this is just, you know, it's going to take too much time, and I'm not the best at the class. And I decided I'm going to go and do computer science, sort of the computer science specialty within the math. And what turns out, so I take this class on, I think, set theory or data structures, algorithms, whatever, and it's trivial. Because my mind, of course, was so sharpened by this 1 year of dealing with abstractions and dealing with definitions that even if you don't think you're understanding them, you're completely in a different level. Then when you go back to something of a lower level, it's a triviality. This is an interesting experience that I have seen time and again with myself, with my kids. You know, you push yourself to a place which is much more abstract and much more formal than maybe you care to be. And inevitably, you start thinking more clearly. And you are able to sort of verbalize and conceptualize and define and understand. It's a fabulous discovery. Somebody has to prove a theorem about it, explaining why is it that being able to verbalize, why is it that being able to define, and using precise concepts and precise thinking makes everything else simpler.
So now you defend the very same thing that caused you to quit, like the abstraction.
I know. I mean, in retrospect, maybe I should have stuck it out for another year, but that's what I did.
It worked out well.
It worked out.
Okay, so then you moved to computer science.
I moved to computer science. I remember a lot of my professors at Carnegie Mellon. I remember Raj Reddy, who was, he taught AI. He was the founder of really speech recognition. At the time, it was the Harpy project. And I remember Anita Jones. She taught software engineering. She was one of my recommenders to graduate school later. So was Raj Reddy. And I remember there was another professor who taught, Nico Haberman, who taught us compilers. And I had a compiler project that I did with a friend. I remember we wrote this compiler, which never compiled. I remember writing this program for generating poetry. So today, you know, they talk in machine learning about GANs, these things that can generate, let's say, poetry in a way that's indistinguishable from let's say, poetry of a particular poet. But at the time, the way these programs generating poetry would work is that you would have some sort of a notion of a verb and a noun and how a sentence is structured. Then you would have a dictionary and you would form poems. I love that.
How large were the classes back then?
Classes were small. I would say there were like about 20 kids. Again, very few women. That I do remember. That I was one of two, and the professor also treated us a little bit with, you know, half. I was going to say forgiveness, but forgiveness might not be the right word. A little bit, you know, like like we were silly, even though we weren't really, and that he you know, after I started doing very well in the class, he realized that. But that was my feeling. Didn't matter to me much because I didn't think of myself that way. But I do remember that. I remember coming from Israel. My command of English was not perfect, to say the least. And on every program that I wrote, there always were these comments where it says indent, indent, indent. I didn't know what the word indent meant till the end of the term. But then I realized that indent meant that I was supposed to, like, you know, indent the for loops and the different commands. So now I know what that means. But it was these silly things, you know. It's like, even I remember the first lesson of calculus, when you come from Israel to America. And I remember telling my brother, who was in school at that time, I said, you know, I can't do this. It's too difficult. So he sat down with me. This is the first class ever in calculus. And he said, okay, so what didn't you understand? And then it turned out that I didn't know the words multiply and divide and integrate and differentiate. And then he told me what it all meant in Hebrew. And I said, that was it. Then it wasn't difficult.
Any other moments of despair and difficulty at that time?
At that time? Well,
you missed your parents?
I miss my parents very much. At that time, you know, in Israel, somehow the idea of a phone call to the US, it was like an impossibility. It wasn't really an impossibility, but it seemed so expensive. Nobody called. So I think I talked to them after 1 year on the phone on my birthday. And I missed them terribly, because I think in their mind I was capable of this journey. But really, internally, I was just a kid.
So you didn't speak to them for a year, you said?
That's right. That's right. They wrote letters.
Letters?
And I wrote letters back, and I wrote letters to my friends, but you didn't speak on the phone. Although I remember that a lot of the kids, when I did speak every once in a while, once a year or something, I remember that the kids in my hall, in the dorms, they said, again, it was like this girl who came from America in Israel, when I told you in first grade. It was this girl who spoke on the phone, and she was saying like, which to them, that's the Hebrew sound, these very guttural sounds. Yeah, that was hard. That was hard. And then I had to make a decision at the end of that year whether to go back to Israel to my army service. And I asked for a deferral, because the truth is that I actually kind of like studying, and I kind of wanted to continue. And so I asked for deferral of the army service.
So it means that you skipped a grade or something? Because you
No, I was just born early. I mean, I was born in November. Somehow my enlisting date was late, so there was enough time there to actually finish a semester or a semester and a half. And then I asked for, maybe even a whole year, and then I asked for deferral, and they get, you know, by the time the deferral came back, I was already finishing my second year. You know, I kept calling the embassy in New York, and they said that I should wait till I get the answer. Yeah. So I finished my degree.
But other difficult moments?
Other difficult moments?
Other happy moments also?
Oh, lots of happy moments. You know, I made lots of new friends, and, you know, and all of a sudden I became a young woman. So there's also like personal relationships that you develop, which happen when you're a young woman. That's regardless of where you're at, is very exciting, right? You're coming of age. And I came of age in Carnegie Mellon, you know, during those years, between the age of 17 and 20.
Okay. Just to be a bit more specific about those years, any particular topics that you related to, specific ones, beyond the
Yeah,
abstract
I was very
level?
interested in AI. I was very interested in artificial intelligence at the time. I think because of the class that I took, because of this poetry generation, because of the whole concept of speech understanding and so forth. And also I think because this whole idea of understanding the brain and how we think and how we dream and why we dream what we dream, that was fascinating to me. So it was very clear to me when I finished that I would like to study this further. And that's why I applied to graduate school. And I applied to graduate school at the same time that I applied for jobs, because I wasn't very clear about what I was going to do. There were sort of 3 options. In fact, this is a story of my life. There's always at least 3 options, sometimes 4, but never 1. And the options then were to go back to Israel, or to go to graduate school, or to get a job. And the idea of going back to Israel was like, I wanted to go back to Israel, but I was very afraid, because at this point I was kind of distanced from the whole thing. And furthermore, I felt that I would like to go back to Israel, but at least I'd like to show something for all these years that I was away. And I felt like I think a lot of people feel when they finish undergraduate school, at least I think they feel, that I knew nothing. Even though I studied, I did my degree in 3 years in the States, although usually it's 4. I studied during the year and I studied during the summers because I wanted to finish quickly so I could go back to Israel. At the end, you feel like, what do I know more than anybody else? I wanted to own something, that there'll be something that I'll understand better than anybody. And it's not even so much the idea of understanding better than anybody, but actually going into some subject in depth. And at that point, it could have been related to artificial intelligence or algorithms. I remember also an algorithms course that was taught by Bentley and by John Bentley, and it was fascinating. And I loved that as well. So I wanted to understand something really well. And I was told that there was this thing called graduate school. You have to understand, I didn't come from an academic family. It wasn't something that was standard.
Did your parents have any degrees? Your father?
So my father, because of the war broke out when he did law school, I don't think he had a degree. He was the head of a few hospitals in Israel, and then he was an administrator in this health services. And my mother, as I said, was she worked at home. And
what about the ancestry, rabbinical?
The ancestry, yeah, there is something there. My grandmother, they always talked about the fact that she had a golden medaille, a golden medal in mathematics, when she was in high school and when she was studying maybe in school after high school. But she didn't. She came to Israel as a pioneer, and they believed that they should work the land. So the Jewish people should be connected to the land. But she has talent for math, because I remember that she loved it when I described her math problems, and she surprised me because she actually understood and she could solve them. My grandfather had no idea. He was like a scholar. He learned with Bialik and Chernichovsky, and he was much more of a humanist, while she was into math. But in terms of being professors or academics, no. So in any case, I was told that there was this thing called graduate school. And I think that like a day or two before, they said that I'm supposed to take this exam called the GRE. I didn't prepare at all. But I signed up and I went to the GRE. I didn't even know you're supposed to prepare, It seems ridiculous how naive it was. So I took the GRE. I don't think I did very well. But in any case, I applied to graduate school. And I got accepted to Carnegie Mellon in engineering and Berkeley in computer science. And first I said to Carnegie Mellon that I'm going to go there. And I went for the summer to the Rand Corporation, where Raj Reddy actually recommended me as an intern. This was in Santa Monica in California on the beach. And I remember this California, wow, the beach. Fantastic, I lived in Venice Beach, and there's the roller skaters and the bikers, and
Mellon,
so I was admitted to Carnegie Mellon, which was the place that I spent my undergraduate, and I was very debating between the two, and I also had a bunch of job offers, but it was clear that I wasn't going to go get a job. I was going to go to graduate school, and I decided I'll go to Carnegie Mellon. I mean, I wasn't sure, but I decided I'll go to Carnegie Mellon because I had friends there, I had a boyfriend, whatever, the kind of things that people have, and friends. But I had the summer job at Rand. And I went out to California with a friend, this woman called Sue Angebrand that I did the compiler project with. She went out, also she had some job in maybe TRW or something, or Jet Propulsion Lab or JPL or one of these companies near Los Angeles, and I was at Rand. And I remember that summer, I cannot tell you what I worked on, but I do remember that I was thinking to myself that the supervisors were all PhDs, and they were telling me what to do. And it was some sort of AI-related project. And I remember thinking to myself, why should they tell me what to do? I should get a PhD and I should tell somebody else what to do. In any case, so that summer was a fabulous summer. First of all, there was research and it was interesting, but I can't tell you what it was about because I really have no recollection whatsoever. And second of all of a sudden it was, I had an apartment of my own on the beach. There was California, as I said before. There were the roller skaters and the bikes. And then one day, me and Sue, we decided to take a drive up the coast, up the California coast, and go and see Berkeley, and go visit someone that she knew in Palo Alto. And I remember I had this small Toyota Corolla, or Corolla, I think, some kind of car that they don't make anymore. Maybe it was a Corona. Anyway, it was this little blue car, And we drove up the coast. And I remember driving into the Berkeley exit on University Avenue. And it was just blue skies that like you've never seen. And the green hills in the background. I'm just sort of driving to campus. It's such a glorious image. I can't tell you, this is something you don't forget. And it was, wow, California, Berkeley. And then I told CMU that I'm not coming, and I told Berkeley that I am coming. Because it was just captivating.
Without even going back to Pittsburgh?
No, without going back to Pittsburgh.
So then at the end of this summer, you went to grad school?
At the end of the summer, I went to graduate school at Berkeley. And I wanted to do AI, as I told you.
What year was that?
This was 1979. So I arrived at Berkeley. I had to find an apartment, the usual things that graduate students do. I lived with a bunch of astronomer graduate students. In any case, I wanted to do artificial intelligence. At the time, there were a few people at Berkeley doing artificial intelligence. But as I told you, serendipity is the name of the game. I was a TA. I had to support myself. So I had a teaching assistantship. And then I actually somehow got to work with Dave Patterson on the RISC project, Reduced Instruction Set, computer,
you can tell a bit about
the RISC project. So at the time, the RISC project was this idea of Patterson and other people at Intel at the time that the thing to do is to figure out which of the instructions are used most often, let's say programs in Pascal, at C, and those are the instructions that should be put in hardware in order to speed up, computation. And my part of the project was to figure out which instructions, in fact, are being used most often in Pascal programs. So I was quite the programmer at the time. And I worked on this very large system, which I think adapted an existing Pascal compiler, sort of thing that collects dynamic statistics. And I modified it sort of extensively to figure out which instructions should really be optimized or put in hardware. And that was my master's thesis, which I got at the end of that year.
Did you enjoy it?
It was Professor Powell and Professor Patterson. Did I enjoy it? Yeah, it was interesting. It was a lot of work. It was very intense. The whole idea of being incredibly focused on a project, and being in the office from day to night, it was born at that time. I mean, as an undergrad, you spend a lot of time in libraries and studying for exams. But this idea that you have your own project and you set your own deadlines, although, the professors expect things of you, it really comes from that time. But at that time also, all of a sudden, I wanted to go back. After I had the master's, I wanted to go back to Israel. I wanted to see Israel again. It's been 4 years. And I went for the summer, and that was one of the highest, after 4 years not being in Israel, just being around here and with my mother and my sister was already a big girl. And I remember taking a bus to Yamit. This was the time when they were actually returning the Sinai Desert. So I was in Israel then for 3 weeks, and then I came back to Berkeley and I continued to my PhD.
This is after 4 years, you haven't seen your family?
No, my father came, my father came for graduation. That was after 3 years. And my mother and sister came after, I got the years wrong. My mother and sister came to Berkeley after 4 years. I went for this trip to Israel after 5 years. Yes, it was 5 years. So I did see them. I saw my father after 3 years. I saw my mother and sister after 4 years.
That's not very often.
No, that's not very often.
Even for the time.
No, yeah.
Okay, so you finished your master's.
And I got to tell you that I might be mixing it up. Perhaps they did come to visit me in Pittsburgh. But not, the quantas are like 2 years.
Yeah. It's the same order of magnitude.
It's the same order of magnitude,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's go back to Berkeley.
Yeah.
And you finished your master's.
I finished my master's.
Is there something about the master, the initial time in Berkeley that you recall that is worthy of mentioning?
No, I remember the professors. There were the theory professors. There was Manuel Blum and Dick Karp and Jean Lawler. And I remember meeting theory students, the theory graduate students. There was Silvio, which later on became a very close friend and a close colleague of mine. There was Vijay Vazirani, there was Faith Fick, there was Joan Plumstead, there was Mike Luby, and they were all contemporaries of mine. And I liked them, I liked some of them more than others, but as things are. And they were interesting characters. And I took a class, I think from Gene Lawler, on scheduling. And I think his graduate, there was a TA there called Chip Martell. Anyway, and I did some project on scheduling with Vijay and Silvio. I remember that.
So that was your first collaboration with Silvio?
It was a project, yeah, right, in class. Yeah, that was the first collaboration. And then I met Manuel Blum, and Manuel offered me to be his student. And I spent the summer working with him. And that was fantastic, because he was such an unusual thinker. And he wanted to work with me, or he suggested that I would be his graduate student. It was a huge compliment.
You felt like it's a compliment at the time?
Yeah, sure. It was a huge compliment.
So who were his other graduate students at the time?
I think that Vijay and Silvio were his graduate students. I think before that it was Mike Sipser and Dana Anglin, and we were sort of the new wave. There was the three of us, maybe Joan too.
What was it about them that you liked at the time? Do you remember?
They were extremely intense. They really loved what they were doing. They would talk about this incessantly, but they were a lot of fun too. Silvio was from Italy and Vijay was from India, and they were so colorful, and they had fabulous sense of humor. And they went out for restaurants all the time, talked about work and told stories. It was really just somehow these were people of the world. So as much as I liked Carnegie Mellon and had a lot of good friends, this was like a different dimension of personalities. If you think about it, people come to graduate school from foreign countries, they have lived a different life, each one of them. They're older, they're sort of more worldly, and I was taken by it.
Any particular memories, events from that, before
from
you
that period,
start? Yeah.
Before research starts,
before,
really.
Yeah. Locations?
Yeah, there is actually a memory or an event, which I've told my younger son, and I think it had effect on him, is that after about maybe like 6 months or almost close to a year in Berkeley, I'm like a graduate student, maybe it's the second year already, I think it's the first year, I had a down period. It was like, it's too hard, and I don't have any original ideas, and I'm never going to get through this, and I'm lonely, I don't know anybody because I didn't have friends yet, close friends. And who do I think I am? And I was torturing myself continuously. What do I think about going to graduate school? Who do I think I am that I can just do this? I decided to leave Carnegie Mellon, where I had lots of friends, and just kind of conquer this new place totally on my own. And I remember going through this cycle again and again and again, and then I had this realization that, okay, maybe it's all true. Maybe I will amount to nothing, and maybe I know nothing, and maybe I'm a failure. But, if I'm going to be against myself, and I'm not going to be my own friend, then who else? And I'm going to have to like myself, whatever I am. I got to accept that. And somehow that was like a very kind of deep, decisive moment. That from then on, everything became better. Because I think it's very important to realize that for graduate students especially, which have moments like this, I'm sure it's universal, where you go, you've decided on this big adventure, and then it's very unclear, right? Are you going to succeed? Are you not going to succeed? There's a lot of competition. Everybody seems better than you. And there's, I think, tendency for self-beating, at least for some people. And it's very important to realize that it is what it is. You got to like yourself, because, when at the end of the day,
and you never
zemayesh.
You never look back?
Look back at what?
No, you never had these thoughts again? They never recurred in your mind? Like the moment you decided, that was it?
About my self-worth?
Yes, your self-worth and your...
No, I've had them again.
Okay, so we'll get to them down the road. Mm-hmm. Okay. Any particular locations in Berkeley at that time?
No, Berkeley was beautiful. You know, there was like some restaurants that we really liked. There was a McDonald's at Berkeley. I remember meeting one of my graduate student fellows, Don Gusfield, who was born in California, raised in California. I remember meeting him. It was right across from the McDonald's, which is an intersection of University and Shattuck. And he asked me where I was going. He was already a senior graduate student. And I said I was going to McDonald's. And he looked at me like, he said, really? I don't think he thought anybody actually eats there. But I came from Pittsburgh, you know, I liked McDonald's. I was like, well, you know, it's a big chain, you know, people do eat there. But that was one more of those moments where I felt that I was different and that I was right. Sense that a better than thou attitude toward the food, which I thought it was excellent. Of course, I don't think so anymore.
Okay. When did that stop?
I think that after many years that you don't eat McDonald's, you actually kind of get sick from it. Yeah.
Okay.
Research. Right.
Manuel Blum.
Manuel Blum. Okay, so Manuel Blum took me as a student. But as things go, it takes time to find a research project. And then Manuel taught this class on algorithmic number theory. And in this class, he taught us about, first of all, you know, the basic elements of number theory, you know, primes and composite numbers and quadratic residues and quadratic non-residues and generators and cyclic groups and all these things, and all from an algorithmic point of view. That is how to test that a number is prime, how to generate a prime, how to find the quadratic residue, how to test that something is a quadratic residue, you know, modular arithmetic and so forth. And always from an algorithmic and analyzing running times. I found it fascinating. I really loved it. I think essentially I just have, you know, it's very basic. I like this stuff.
I remember you teaching me this.
That's right. So I really love this material. And at the end, he had a few lectures where he talked about cryptography. And at that point, there was essentially RSA, encryption scheme, which is a public key encryption scheme, which is a way to send messages, you know, between people who have never met before, secret messages. And it all is based on the fact that it's hard to factor composite numbers, which are product, let's say, of two primes, but it's easy to generate prime numbers. And that was nice. And then there was another lecture on another method there would be another method by Merkel-Hellman, which Adi Shamir broke. And he did some cryptanalysis. That was interesting as well. And then he asked the question, which was, I think, really defining from the rest of my career. And he said, there's an Alice and Bob, and they are deciding to get a divorce. Alice is in Boston, and Bob is in San Francisco, or vice versa. And they have to decide who gets the dog. And they want to be fair, so they decide to toss a coin, except they're not in the same place. And they have to toss a coin over the phone, except neither one wants a dog, or both want the dog, whichever is the case. And you know, the idea that Alice tosses the coin and then she says to Bob it's heads, you know, doesn't exactly work because they don't trust each other. So he asked, how would you do that? Can you use number theory to do that? So what's the connection? You know, why number theory? And that was sort of fascinating. Can you use sort of number theory, the idea that, let's say, factoring numbers is a hard problem, and there's a public key encryption, to toss coins over the telephone. And I started thinking about it, you know, and I had an idea. And the idea was, at the time, I don't know if it's too technical for this interview, the idea for the time was that there is this function, which is exponentiation function, like g to the x mod p, and the idea was to essentially hide, for Alice to pick like a random x and send g to the x mod p to Bob, and have him guess what x is. And this is a function which is hard to, from g to the x, it's hard to find x. It's hard to invert. And he guesses something, he tries to guess x, or actually, to be more precise, he tries to guess something about x. Okay, like whether x is odd or even or greater than a certain value, p over 2, or smaller than p over 2. And if he makes a guess, then she tells him what x is, and she can check if the guess is correct or not. And if the guess is correct, it's like heads have been tossed, and if the guess is incorrect, it's like tails. And Sylvia and I talked about it, told Sylvia about this, and then you needed to prove something, right? You needed to prove that this is like a coin toss, that really it's impossible for Bob to guess better than 50-50, whether x was greater than, let's say, p over 2 or smaller than p over 2. And we had some proof, but there was a bug in it. And that was sort of the beginning of a lot of cryptography.
Okay, so you're telling a story that is not related directly to encryption. That's one thing. Cryptography,
It
like,
is
is
related
defined.
to encryption.
It's of course related, but the story itself, like, is only anecdotally.
Right.
And I want to ask at this point, how much context about cryptography did you have at the time beyond what Manuel done?
Nothing. Zero. Zero.
Did you know about Shannon's work?
Nothing. He didn't. That was not part of the class. The class was about number theory and applications of number theory. I think that's what interested Manuel.
Yeah, so why did Manuel Blunt teach that class at that time?
Because we're talking about 1980. Was it 1980 or 1981? And the invention of public key cryptography was 76, I guess, and then the RSA...
Maybe you can give some context
right,
to the
so in
general...
1976, there was this incredible paper by Diffie and Hellman, which suggested this idea that we are having this possibility of digital communication, that eventually everybody's going to be communicating with everybody else over the digital network. This is the case today, it wasn't the case at 76, but the possibility was there. And they were asking, how can we utilize this in order to kind of shift the world into this mode of electronic commerce? I think they even talked about these things explicitly in this paper. And they brought up these two possibilities. One is what they called public key encryption, which is a way for, let's say, an Alice and a Bob who've never met before to communicate secretly. So somehow there would be a directory where Alice would publish something that they called a public key, and Bob could read Alice's public key and use that in order to send her coded messages that only she, who knew also a private key, would be able to read, but no one else could. This was one thing. And another thing that they suggested is this idea of a digital signature, which is that people could sign documents so that everybody can verify that Shafi signed it, but but only Shafi could sign it. So as you know, handwritten signatures, if I have a signature, it looks the same no matter which document I put it on. Here the case was that you would take a document and you would do a transformation to a new document, which is called a signed document. And the ability to perform the transformation would be something that each user in the system, Shafi or Alon, could do in a way unique to them, because they knew some information or some private key that enabled them to do so, and yet there was a matching verification key that would be able to verify that this was signed by Shafi, or alternatively something was signed by Alon. So in any case, they proposed these two things. They didn't exactly give ways to do it. A year later, there was a paper by Rives, Shamir, and Adelman where they showed how to do it using number theory. And around the same time, there was also a paper by Michael Rabin who showed yet a different way to do it, also based on number theory. And Manuel taught those three papers because they were just mind-boggling. This whole idea, very tantalizing. And not only that, I think that Len Adelman, so it's Rives, Shamir, and Adelman, was a student of Manuel's. So there was some affinity there as well. But one would have to ask Manuel why he taught that class. I think it was the first time he did teach that class in any case. I think, you know what, maybe not. Maybe he has taught it before. Maybe because there's these notes, these lecture notes on number theory by Dana Englund. So he must have taught it before when Dana was a student. But I don't think he taught the public key cryptography part of it.
Who else was in the class besides you and Silvio?
Me, Silvio, Vijay, Mike Luby, the usual suspects. I mean, all the crowd at Berkeley was there. Jeff Shallett was another good friend at Berkeley, Eric Bach.
They went on to do computational number theory.
That's right, that's right. So Eric has this very famous paper about how to generate primes in factored form, which is an important paper for generating generators for ZP star. And Jeff Shallett and also had very interesting work, and they have a book together on computational number theory. And we were all colleagues and friends. Okay. And we're still friends.
Okay, so now it begins.
Now it begins. Right, so, okay, so Sylvia and I decided to work on the following problem. And the problem was how to play mental poker. Because there was one other paper that Manuel mentioned, and that was a paper by Shamir and Edelman, where they used their encryption scheme in order to show how to play mental poker. What is mental poker? So people probably know what poker is, although I didn't, because my parents didn't play cards, and the whole idea of card playing was supposed to be this bourgeoisie thing that you did not do. That there were these families in Israel that they played poker, and they were considered, you know, somehow there was something improper about it. But again, this is my upbringing from the very kind of proletarian background. Anyway, so this mental poker protocol by Shamir, Vest, and Adelman, the idea is, again, we are two players. We don't have a physical deck. We want to play poker over the phone, over the computer line. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to deal cards in such a way that you're going to get a random hand, I'll get a random hand, and once we get the cards, they're not in the deck anymore, without knowing what each other's decks are. So they had an ingenious idea where there was a way to deal cards in such a way that it wasn't obvious. That, I mean, it seemed like you don't know what my cards are, but I did choose random cards, and same for you. But Lipton noticed that this protocol, there was a problem with it. That there was something about the implementation of this protocol that they proposed, okay, where it's true that you couldn't tell what my cards were, but you could possibly tell some information about my cards. So for example, let's say that the high cards, you could identify something was a high card versus a low card. So there was something about the encoding of the cards that did not hide all information about the card. Now for a card game, that's detrimental, right? If you know that I have a high versus a low card, that changes your strategy completely. So the problem we set out to solve was, how are you going to play mental poker hiding all partial information about the cards? And I remember, so we were thinking about this problem and what do we need? And Silvio had this idea that we need to have some encryption scheme that, not an encryption scheme, we didn't talk about encryption. I think it was Silvio's idea that we need a decision question. Like a yes-no question, where it's hard to tell whether it's a yes or no, better than 50-50. But this is like an abstraction, right? It's a little bit like the Diffie-Hellman, and because I love the number theory, I remember sitting in a seminar where some people were talking about something else. And in fact, I must say that this repeats in my career over and over again. I get ideas while I sit in seminars where people talk about something else, which is probably a good reason to go to seminars. And all of a sudden I had this idea about quadratic residues. I said, you know what? I was thinking to myself that the way to encode the 0 and 1, the decision question would be that to decide whether a number is a quadratic residue or quadratic non-residue mod a composite number, mod n. And this was a hard problem. Manuel told us this was a hard problem. Hard problem in the sense there were no efficient algorithms to solve it. And the reason why I thought it was a good idea is because it seemed to be a problem which is hard on the average. So in fact, you can not just tell whether something is a quadratic residue or non-residue, but you couldn't really do better than 50-50. Now one would have to prove that, right? But there was something about this problem, which is the notion that we then later on to define formally, which is called random self-reducibility. So it was sort of a way that if you had one number, if it was a quadratic residue, you can generate lots of quadratic residue, or if it was a quadratic non-residue, you could generate lots of quadratic non-residues. And then that means that if you could sort of distinguish one set from the other, even a little bit, you'll be able to distinguish whether your original number was a quadratic residue or quadratic non-residue.
How did you feel at that moment, or?
That moment of thinking about the quadratic residuosity being the right problem, and then telling Silvio, God, excitement, it's just, incredible. Because, pretty quickly, we could sort of come up with a proof. And then, just to come back to the mental poker, the idea was if you could, this would be a way to write down a card. So let's say the card is five of diamonds, okay? Then you would write this down in binary, the 5 of diamonds, and now you wanna, so that's in 0 1s, and now you wanna encrypt the 0, encrypt the 1, encrypt the 0, encrypt the 1, each time encoding it by this question, by a different quadratic or non-quadratic residue. Quadratic residue for zeros, let's say, non-residues for 1, you choose them at random, and now you have an encoding of the card, which is what we would call later probabilistic encryption or randomized encoding.
At the time, did you realize it's public encryption? Or
we didn't even realize it was encryption. We had a card. We had a way to encode cards so that we could prove that there's no way you can distinguish one card from the next, because you couldn't distinguish zeros from ones better than 50-50. And then we went to Dick Karp, I think, because Manuel was on leave at MIT for a semester, and we told him about this. And he asked us, what about other partial information, not just whether it's 0 or 1? And in these questions professors ask you are incredibly significant, because you don't think this way, right? I mean, now it's an immediate question, but at the time it was a very fundamental question. And then we went away and proved that if you could tell any partial information, so you had to define what partial information would be, so that would be some sort of function of, the string, any function of the string, better than 50-50, then you could actually reconstruct the individual bits of the card, which was imply that you could tell whether a number was a quadratic residue versus a quadratic non-residue, which was a hard problem.
Can you tell something about the process of figuring out the right definition?
So, the way I'm telling it to you, it's really derived from the goal. So the goal was to play mental poker in such a way that it hides all partial information. In order to do that, it was clear that you had to encode every bit individually. And furthermore, it was clear that you would have to encode them in a probabilistic manner, because otherwise you couldn't hide all partial information. And then there was that question of Karp, so we arrived to the question, what is partial information? It should be any function, right, that kind of divides the world of cards into, partitions them. Because you're not allowed to be able to partition them in any way. So any function that partitions them into sort of the left and the right, The process was just, it was like being in some kind of a mad state of creativity. And working with Silvio was just a very intense experience. As anybody who's worked with him knows, any students, I mean, there's no day and no night. And I think he's still that way. I'm not, but at the time I was. He was very intense. It was very exciting. And of course we didn't do it completely in isolation. There were these questions that, let's say, Karp asked us, and then I think maybe it was him, or maybe we understood already there's a way to encrypt here. That it doesn't have to do with card games. There's a way to encrypt a 0 and encrypt a 1. That's something that was not known, because the public encryption of reverse Shamir and Adelman, or even the Diffie-Hellman concept, it really was intended of encrypting, long messages which are unknown. And here, 0 and 1, you know that everybody knows either I'm encrypting a 0 or 1, but they can't tell which is which. So this was a completely new way to encrypt information. So we understood this is much bigger than it was. But and then we went to consult people in the number theory. In math department, there was Lamer, and he was the expert. And we were supposed to talk to him and ask him, is it really the case that you cannot tell apart quadratic residues from non-residues? Maybe sometimes it's not possible, but better than 50-50? And I remember this quote. He said, we told him the whole story, and we asked him what would he do if he needed to distinguish whether a number was a square or non-square mod n. He said that if it was less than n over 2, he would bet it was a square. And we asked him why, and he said because there's a lot of small perfect squares. And but he said, but he's not a betting man. But then it turned out that this is okay, because this doesn't give much of an advantage.
When you came to him, did you feel that the stakes are high already?
No, we came to him like these 2 young graduate students, and he was very accepting, a little bit maybe. He thought it was a little humorous, because it's such a frivolous question, right? Playing cards, using quadratic residues. But I think the whole attitude of mathematicians to computer science has changed radically. Not to say that he wasn't it wasn't helpful. It was extremely helpful. But in general, I think at the time, mathematics was this hard science and it was serious, right? And the whole computer scientists and the algorithmic aspects and using it for cryptography was considered more of a, I think, a toy activity. I think this is very, very different now. If I look at the mathematicians at MIT, and I'm sure it's true all over the world, they have respect, because we are studying hard questions, we are studying important questions, we've made impact on the world. Cryptography certainly made a lot of impact. It's making a lot of impact today. And only more so, as you well know as well.
And I'm asking again about the stakes because I'm curious to know, when did you realize how big your discovery is at the time?
Right, so we realized that we have actually a scheme for encrypting single bits. Something that was an open question that hasn't been, nobody addressed it. And when you encrypt the single bits, obviously it's going to have to be a randomized method. Otherwise, because it's the public key encryption, so everybody can encrypt zeros and everybody can encrypt one. And if all encryption zeros were the same, when you see the encryption, you can just yourself try to encrypt 0, try to encrypt 1. And if it's the same as what was sent, you know what was sent. So it has to be the case that there's lots of encryptions of zeros and lots of encryptions of ones, and an adversary shouldn't be able to distinguish whether we're encrypting zeros or ones. So here comes the definition. We want not to be able to distinguish the encryption of zeros and ones. That's what we call semantic security. You cannot actually have any better than 50-50 plus non-negligible probability of success. Now, in the context of a protocol, okay, if you think about this mental poker example, not only that you're encrypting the cards, but there's a lot of other information going around. There's the dealing of the cards, and there's many cards that are being encrypted. And you could ask the question whether being part of this game, playing the cards, maybe you gain more and more knowledge as you go along, so that now you're able to distinguish the encryption of 0 from encryption of 1. So in order to prove that's not the case, we came up with this idea of a proof by simulation. The idea being is that you say, well, let's suppose that your goal in the world, really, you have no interest in mental poker, but what you want to distinguish is quadratic residues, quadratic non-residues, okay? And somebody tells you that there is this mental poker game that's built on encoding cards with quadratic residues and quadratic non-residues, and they know how to cheat in this card. So what you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to show a reduction now. I'm going to show how to, in some sense, show that if, in fact, there is this person or this adversary, which we usually call him, who is able to cheat in the mental poker game, even by slightly better than he should, then there is a way to use this strategy and turn it into an algorithm that can distinguish quadratic residues from non-residues. Since you believe that quadratic residues and non-residues cannot be distinguished in polynomial time, it means that such strategy does not exist. But how do you show such a reduction? In a sense, you need to simulate everything, the entire view of the adversary. That is the encoding of the cards and the dealing and everything that went on and was available to him to enable his treating strategy. So this is what's called the proof by simulation, which later has become a big paradigm in cryptography and how to actually prove security proofs. You can only prove security if you can sort of recreate the real world in which cryptography is used. And if you can simulate it, it means that it must have not been that useful, because you could have simulated anyway.
In hindsight, you can view Shannon security as being the information theoretic sort of analog of semantic security. Did you see that at the time, or you came
No, we didn't really know about Shannon's paper because we were ignoramuses, which helped us actually. So Shannon's information theory, in fact, if you look at the definition, essentially says that the probability of two messages is the same given the ciphertext. It's one way to think of Shannon security. An equivalent definition is the a posteriori and a priori probability of a message is the same whether you give a priori without giving the ciphertext, posteriori after giving the ciphertext. So in other words, that ciphertext gives no information about the message. Or if you think about the first definition, ciphertext for M0, which could be just the bit 0, ciphertext for the bit 1, you cannot, there is no information in there that can tell you whether it was a 0 or 1. So if you think about semantic security, it's the computational analog of it. That is, in principle, information theoretically, you actually do have enough information to tell whether you're encrypting a 0 or 1. Because it's a public key encryption scheme, just because of the way the whole thing is set up, but computationally within polynomial time, you don't. If distinguishing quadratic residues from non-residues is a hard problem, if factoring integers is hard. Of course, it could be that factoring integers is easy. We know that by quantum computers, factoring integers is easy. And then this whole tower of cards collapses. Fortunately, today, this was the first probabilistic encryption scheme. Today, we have a lot of other problems, not just quadratic residues versus quadratic non-residues, not just the factoring problem, but problems on integer lattices. So problems essentially from geometry, where we can also sort of embed this idea of a decision question, which is hard to solve, and it's really impossible to decide the decision question better than 50-50, and we encode 0 by a decision question where the answer is yes, and 1 by a decision question where the answer is no. And these lattice problems, I mention them because they are, right now, quantum resilient. So in other words, we don't know any quantum computer algorithms that can solve them efficiently. So they're what we call post-quantum cryptographic candidates.
Okay. So at the time, the idea of basing something on an unproven assumption, it was in the air. It was kind of a bold move.
Well, if you think about RSA, they're also basing it on an unproven assumption. They are the first. They are assuming that factoring integers is a hard problem. And we took another problem, which was distinguishing squares from non-squares. But obviously, that's an assumption. And, mathematics prides itself by having proofs, and proofs are proofs and not conjectures. So there's an underlying conjecture here, and that is that there's a problem which we don't know how to solve efficiently. But if you think about it, all of complexity theory is predicated on this idea that the class P of polynomial time problems and the class NP of problems which you can verify the correctness of the solution in polynomial time are disjoint. So P is different in NP. So to give meat to the entire field, there is an underlying conjecture which is widely believed but not proven.
And at the time, what was the atmosphere? Did you experience any resistance to this idea?
To the probabilistic encryption? So we submitted to a conference and he got in the first time. And this was a conference in San Francisco. I think it was a stock conference, and I gave the paper. And the name of the paper was How to Play Poker, Hiding All Partial Information and Probabilistic Encryption. It was a long title. And I think that people were genuinely very positive. But speaking with people afterwards, I think they had no idea what I was talking about. But certainly in the cryptographic crowd, there was excitement.
Was it your first talk in a conference?
Yes.
And how did you feel?
I felt in the top of the world.
How well attended was it?
At that time, the conferences were very well attended. So there were no parallel sessions, and people came to the entire conference, and it was a fairly small community, and it was very well attended.
Can you tell us a bit more about the atmosphere at the conferences back then?
I think that very, very, very intimate, very informed people. There were already people who were working on different fields, algorithms and complexity theory. Here's a cryptography example on distributed computing. People started talking then about Byzantine agreement. A lot of these big ideas that are still around as sort of fundamental problems were being discovered at the time.
Were you attending all talks?
Yeah, I was. Everybody was.
And was it accessible to everybody, to a wider audience than it is today? How do you compare?
I think so. But it's natural when a field is young and not overburdened by definitions and history and background, it's easier to understand. On the other hand, people give much better talks today. So people have learned how to simplify their talks. PowerPoint has helped quite a bit. And people have more respect to distilling the essence rather than giving all details. But as in all things, they're better speakers and worse speakers, and that hasn't changed.
Okay, so then you were, you published in San Francisco. That was 81?
That was 81.
And what happened next? How did things
81,
evolve?
82. Then, I have been to Berkeley at that point for 3.5 years. And I had, a very strong urge to get a job and leave. Somehow, I think about it now, I don't know why it was so urgent to leave, but Berkeley seemed to me then like this small place, and it's time to go. And I applied for a postdoc, and I got a postdoc with Ron Rivest at MIT. And I was there for half a year, actually. And then they were looking faculty members, and I started interviewing for faculty positions all over the country and also at MIT. And I got an offer for a faculty position, and I started on the faculty in '83.
After having published what results?
So there was this probabilistic encryption paper, then there was another paper which we start realizing that it's not just this particular quadratic residues versus non-residue, but you can take actually any function, which is what we call a one-way function. That is a function which is easy to compute but hard to invert, and in particular the RSA function. And we asked what bit about, so the RSA function is you take an x and you take it to some power, like x to the cubed or x to the fifth or x to the e, some exponent mod n. And the question is, what about x is really well hidden in the sense that you can't guess better than 50-50. And so I did the paper on that, you know, looking at the bits of x and proving that they are as hard to guess as it is to invert.
And this was still at Berkeley, or?
This was still at Berkeley, yeah.
With who was the paper? Do you
This
remember?
was Silvio and Potong, which was another graduate student. I think that those were the two papers that I had.
Okay,
Yeah.
and you got the assistant professor
At MIT,
position
yeah.
at MIT.
Yeah.
And you moved there when?
I think it was 83.
83.
Yeah.
Okay, so you started as faculty in MIT.
I started faculty at MIT, and Silvio came a semester later. He was at University of Toronto, and he moved to he also got a faculty position at MIT. And it was like an incredibly intellectually exciting time. Oded Goldreich, who's now at Weizmann, came as a postdoc. There was Benny Shore, who was a graduate student there. And later also Yoam Moses came. I think Michael Benor was there for some period of time. And all these people were, they were young, they were brilliant, they were enthusiastic. We would work from day to night, and then we would have dinners and talk about work and go to movies. And cryptography was starting to march along, you know. So I think that the next thing that I did was this paper on pseudorandom functions. So the question was, there was an early paper by Manuel Blum and Silva Micali on how to generate pseudorandom numbers in a way that you cannot distinguish these pseudorandom numbers from truly random. And the next question was, how do you actually not generate just a polynomial list of numbers, but a very, very long list of numbers, which exponentially long list of numbers, in a way that you could sort of jump in the middle. So another way to think of it is a function. So
and what was the motivation for this specific question, given that you can generate a polynomially long?
The motivation was that there are a lot of applications where you want to sort of at random access. So for example, I think this is one of the original motivations we had in the paper. So we called it an identify friend or foe system. So we were saying, let's say that in a group, we want to identify ourselves to each other, but there's some enemies that come along. And we don't want to use this password system where they ask, what's the password? I tell them what the password is, now they know. So instead, I want them to ask me a random sort of question, which I can answer. If we are from the same group, they can verify my answer is correct. But anybody else, really, as far as they're concerned, it's a random guess. So if you had what we call a pseudo-random function, there is a way for all of us who know the secret of this function, or what we call the seed of this function, to be able to compute this function f on any x, and then the random challenge would be x, and I will tell you what f of x is. But being pseudo-random means that for anybody else, they can't tell it apart from a random function. So when they are asked x, f of x to them is like totally random. That's an application.
So on that thread,
yeah.
I'm curious to hear how much of a role did practical motivation play in coming up with these notions?
With these notions? That's a very good question, because it's not clear what you mean practical. When you say practical today, you mean there's going to be a startup that's going to implement it. No such thing. No startups. Nobody implementing. So that the level of practical that makes any sense at that time is to say that there is a story, like identify friend or foe, or people sending encrypted messages, or people trying to authenticate themselves. And somehow I think those stories were important for narrative, you know, because as I told you, I've always liked stories, like the biblical stories. And in general, I think people have an easier time to read, especially in a new field where there isn't a mathematical problem that's been defined for many years, and that people are interested in and they don't need any motivation. In a new field, you need to compel people. And stories are helpful. But for us, you know, it was really more of an intellectual story. So the pseudorandom number generator was just a polynomial sequence of numbers. And then the question about being able to kind of have an exponential sequence where you can sort of jump in the middle and just generate a polynomial number of them, or this abstraction of a pseudorandom function, is what interested in us. And once you had it, you could tell a story. Many stories.
Did you feel so you didn't feel any pressure to practically motivate any of your...
No. None.
None.
No.
And what do you think about this versus the alternative?
Which alternative? That I had to practice?
Yeah. The need to find practical motivation?
I think that every once in a while I have graduate students and they, you know, they come up with a question. For example, I have these two students now that they asked about pseudorandom functions. It says, what happens if you actually tell this, somebody knows the secret of how to generate these pseudorandom values? Does it still possess some cryptographic hardness? This is a very technical question, but some of the reactions they got is that, what is the application? And they came to me and they asked me if they should work on it, they shouldn't work on it, what's my opinion, is it interesting? I said, it's very interesting. It's intellectually interesting, they had a beautiful sort of approach to it, they had a beautiful proof. And at the end, you know, that's the nugget, right? It's sort of something that captivates you. You have to use some ingenuity to solve it, and you have insight. And if it's important, even for applications, it will emerge, but it's not necessarily obvious in the moment that you start. And sometimes if it is very obvious, first of all, lots of people work on it. And you know, competition is good, but only to a certain extent. If everybody's working on the same problem, there's some kind of, I don't know. I don't like to be in a space that's very crowded.
How did it feel back then in the early MIT days in terms of competition?
Right. So as I said, we were a big happy family, but big happy family of a lot of people who wanted to do well. So we worked collaboratively. We've got a lot of joint papers also with Benny on this thing called verifiable secret sharing, and with Oded on pseudorandom function. But we each started, you know, within a couple of years, you know, everybody started going in their own way as well. Because, you know, you are in an academic system, they compare you, they promote you in different times, they tell you that you should kind of shine individually. And I personally, you asked how did I feel. So remember we talked about the crisis of becoming a graduate student? That was again a time which was extremely difficult. Because you're trying to do something new, you're trying to do it on your own, you are always comparing yourself to the people around you who are always brilliant and more brilliant than you are. And you don't know that they're all feeling the same thing. You know, this imposter feeling, apparently they're all feeling it. Some of them admit it, some of them don't admit it. But once you realize that this is the name of the game, I think again, it's these moments of realization.
So did you have such a moment?
Yes.
When was that?
I think I was talking to somebody and they told me about this imposter. I told them about how I feel. And they told me about this imposter syndrome, which now everybody knows it, but then I asked what it was, and they explained, and it was like, okay.
That was a person external to the...
Yeah, like a friend, yeah.
Okay. What about teaching? Do you have any memories?
Yeah, so teaching, I started, and then Sylvia also together, teaching this class on cryptography. And it was the course of Manuel Blum, but with a lot more. Because at this point, the cryptography was a big part of it. You know, there was the definition of bit security and semantic security of encryption and the mental poker and the partial information, pseudorandom functions, pseudorandom number generator. It started being a field. And we haven't talked about zero knowledge yet.
That was before zero knowledge?
Well, at the same time. It was before he got in, but...
So before we get to zero knowledge, who were the students in this class that you remember?
And the students, yeah, there was Johan Hastad, there was Joe Killian, there was Bill Ayalo. I think in the early years, there was Ishai Mansour, but I think he was a little bit later. Those are the students. There's Paul Feldman, who was a student of Silvio's. The others were a student of mine.
Okay.
And they're all big names, fantastic researchers in their own right.
How did the other MIT faculty treat the young field of cryptography? How did they?
So MIT is an incredible place. I think that they really have had the foresight of hiring people who were not necessarily in the mainstream of theory of computing, but sort of doing something with the tools of theory computing, which is a little bit on the fringes. And Revest was like that. Public key cryptography, after all, was exciting, but it was unusual, right? And Silvio and I certainly, and Charles Lysoson was doing also things which were, you know, with applications at that time. I think it was data structures and stuff like that. And Nancy Lynch was doing distributed computing and Byzantine agreement and lower bounds Byzantine agreement. So I felt that they were incredibly proud of all achievements, and especially Ron Rivas, who was a major mentor. Because now that I think of it, he wasn't really much older than we were. Maybe 5, maybe 10 years, no more. And he was extremely supportive of us. I have a paper joint with him, digital signatures, but by and large, we each did our own thing. And I think Ron started working on computational learning fairly quickly, so he kind of left the cryptography field and did that sort of in a more commercial setting for a few years.
And the story about is the story about the writing of the Goldwasser Mikhail Rivest paper in 2 hours? Is it true?
In 2 hours? No, it's the talk. So Ron was giving a talk in a rum session about this. So we had this idea and we worked on it, and then I told Ron or maybe Silvio and I told Ron that maybe he should give a talk in the rum session. So in the crypto conference there are these 10-minute or 5-minute presentations, and he just sat there and he wrote his slides, and they came out so eloquent. I mean, he's really remarkable. Yeah.
What other faculty do you remember from the time being supportive?
Albert Meyer was very supportive. I remember this first award that he put me up to, the Grace Mary Hopper Award, and I think he was really a very significant mentor in his own way, sort of in the background. I mean, Ron was in my field, right? So it was sort of more of a daily advice or monthly advice. But Albert was the head of the theory group, and he saw something in me and put me up for this award, which, you know, made me feel good, made me be recognized.
Okay, is it time for zero knowledge?
Yeah, I think so. So zero knowledge, all right. So this whole idea of having a protocol where, let's say, 2 people are sending messages back and forth, and there's a goal for the protocol usually. The goal might be in the context of going back to that mental poker, say you want to prove that the cards that you encoded were encoded properly, but you don't want to say what the encoding was. Okay, so there's a statement here, and that is that all 52 cards have been encrypted, and no 2 cards are the same, but you're not going to tell me which card is which. Okay, then there is apparently a way to do. We showed a way to do this, which amounts to actually showing whether something is a quadratic residue or a quadratic non-residue, so that I can prove to you that something is a quadratic residue, or that something is an encryption of 0, or let's say the 2 things are encrypting different bits, in such a way that you will have learned nothing else.
So you had a protocol.
So we had a protocol. And now we have to have a definition. What does it mean, prove, so that you learn nothing else? And the definition went back to the simulation paradigm. So sort of we had this definition which said that a proof or a protocol is zero knowledge to whoever I'm proving it to. So I'm a prover, I know something, and I'm proving it to you. I'm proving you some mathematical statement without actually giving you the proof. Which seems a bit weird. So at the end you'll be convinced that the statement is correct, but what do I want? I want you not to be able to prove it to a third party. Okay? In fact, I want you to learn nothing from it. So how do you define it? The way you define it is that whatever you could have computed before you interacted with me, okay, that's no different than what you can compute after you interact with me. Okay? And an equivalent definition to that is that you could essentially simulate the entire interaction between us. And if you could indeed do so, it means that interacting with me was useless to you, assuming the theorem statement is correct.
The name simulator, when did it come about?
Who remembers?
At what stage?
I think
There's a story about multiple rejections.
Okay, so right. So this paper we didn't actually call it simulation, I don't think. I think it had some other definition. There are many names to this paper. It was participatory proofs, interactive proofs such that hide all partial information. There were many, many, many names till we got to the final name, which was interactive proofs and zero knowledge, or the knowledge complexity of interactive proof. And the paper was rejected like 6, 7 times, God knows. But we were very persistent, you know.
How did you feel with each rejection? What's the...
Well, you know, there were 3 of us. I mean, in the beginning there were 2 of us actually on this paper, Sylvia and I. And then Charlie Rakov joined. He improved the paper, but it also got rejected. Because there were 3 of us, we could sort of build each other up. And how did we feel? Felt like everybody else was an idiot.
So you had this confidence back then that you're onto something.
But this concept was so interesting, and we liked them, and it was clear that this is a great paper.
And Charlie Rakov was at the time where?
He was in Toronto.
At Toronto. So you were. How did the interaction work back then?
So I think Sylvia and Charlie interacted when Sylvia was in Toronto. They had some paper on coin tossing or something, and then Sylvia came to MIT, and we continued working on the interactive proofs. But I think there must have been some interaction between them. It really wasn't a 3-way interaction.
But how was communication with people from other institutions working in general?
Well, there was email, but there certainly wasn't, the World Wide Web, or it wasn't immediate. There were phone calls, a lot of phone calls. There were visits.
Do you remember any notable visitors and/or visits from the time, or from?
At MIT?
Yes.
Adi used to come to work with Ron. And again, I told you there were Oded, Goldwasser was around, and that's about it.
Okay. So zero knowledge was rejected, and you said the manuscript improved over time with the rejection?
It did improve over time. You know, we had sort of, in the beginning, I think the simulation was under a computational assumption, then it became without an assumption. Finally, it got in, okay? We were mighty happy. And we went to the conference. I'm trying to remember who gave that talk, if it was me or Silvio. I don't remember. But in any case, at the same time, at the same conference, there was another paper, which was called Arthur Maryland Games. This was a paper by Babai, who introduced this concept, and Mohan, who introduced this concept where there was a prover and a verifier like we had, except the prover's name was Merlin, and the verifier's name was Arthur. And the difference between a verifier and Arthur was that Arthur was just tossing coins. He was very naive. And Merlin then, based on Arthur's coins, he would kind of teach him things or prove to him things, such that he, if he was proving a correct statement, Arthur would believe it. It's we call completeness. And if he was proving an incorrect statement, it doesn't matter what strategy Merlin would employ, Arthur would not believe it. And that was the same as interactive proofs, except our verifier didn't just toss coins. He tossed coins and did computations, and based on these computations would send messages.
And their motivation was totally...
Their motivation, there were some group theoretic problems that they wanted to show were in NP, but they couldn't, so they allowed in NP, you also can think of it as a proof system, where there is an all-powerful prover, and he writes down a string, which is a short proof. It can be checked in polynomial time. In interactive proof, it can go back and forth, so the prover can send a string, the verifier asks a question based on some coin tosses, prover sends another string, go back and forth, and in the end the verifier says, I'm convinced.
So essentially in your paper there are 2 main big...
So what I'm saying is, sorry, just to finish that thought, is that what Babai was trying to show, some group theoretic problem was in NP, but he couldn't. So what he did is he added this Arthur that was able to toss coins. And for an Arthur that could toss coins, there was a short interaction by which you could show that some group membership problem.
And when did you realize that it's a similar related concept?
When
at
did
the
we
conference?
realize?
Was it at the time of the conference?
I think it was at the conference.
And did you already realize back then, view it as a generalization of proof systems?
Yeah, we did. I don't know if they did, because for them it was really a system to show a complexity, the complexity of certain problems. So they defined the complexity class and showed that that problem was in the complexity class. For us, it was always the case because we were coming from the cryptographic setting. So there were parties. There were these Alice and Bob, where Alice was the prover saying Bob was the verifier.
No, but there's a complexity point of view and there's a cryptographic point of view. There's an interactive proof.
No,
and
but
what I mean
about interactive proof is that there was there was a story. There was a prover and a verifier. And they, regardless of whether they would think of them as cryptographic agents or not, the prover's goal was to prove a statement, and the verifier's goal was to verify a statement. So it was a proof system. And then a class was all those statements or languages where you can prove membership in the language or correctness of the statement via such an interactive proof. Yes, so we did understand.
To what extent did you understand the important open problems that emerged from this new concept at the time?
Yeah, they were abundant. So one question was whether this system of Babai and interactive proofs were the same. So he had the system of Arthur Mellon, we had this verifier prover. Arthur could only toss coins, the verifier could actually toss coins and compute on them, and that seemed to be a very important feature that enabled you to prove things you couldn't do just with coin tossing. So that was a clear question. And then Mike Sipser and I, we proved that those two classes were the same. Interestingly, it all started again from the quadratic residue question, which was a question that kind of followed my career, because it seemed like to prove that something was a quadratic a non-residue required, without sort of revealing information, required a verifier's power to hide the results of his coin tosses. And I was talking to Mike about this, and then he had this idea that we could look at the set of all quadratic residues and the set of quadratic non-residues and talk about whether the union of those sets, anyway, talk about sizes of sets and relate that to the question of whether a number was a quadratic residue or quadratic non-residue, which is related in turn to the question whether Arthur Mellon games and interactive proofs are the same class or not.
Did you have any applications in mind beyond the original mental poker application?
Not really. It was again a concept. How do you prove a theorem in such a way that you will believe the statement, but you will learn nothing else, with the definition that I gave you, and that you won't be able to prove the theorem to a third party. But very quickly after, as soon as the paper came out, Adi Shamir pointed out the application for identity theft. So here in this situation, you would think about me, what identifies me is the fact that I know how to prove some theorem. And nobody else knows, because it's a difficult theorem to prove. But I have the proof. How do I have the proof? Maybe the proof is something like I know the factorization of some number. How do I know it? Because I took two primes and I've multiplied them. So of course I know how to factor it. And I want to prove to you that I know this factorization, or something about this factorization that only I will know. And that was identifies Shafi, that there's this composite number and she knows how to factor it. And he realized that this is an identification method. And he took actually a protocol that we have for proving that something is a quadratic residue and made it more efficient, sort of in terms of how many rounds you need to accomplish it. And this is a work with Fiat and Shamir, and this became an identification scheme. But the interesting thing about zero knowledge is that is really the tip of the iceberg. Maybe the tip of the iceberg is the wrong analogy. In any case, that's just scratching the surface. Because it turned out that even though we showed the definition of zero knowledge and applications of zero knowledge in the sense of particular number theoretic questions you could do in zero knowledge, like whether something is a square or non-square, it had a much wider applicability. There's a follow-up paper by Silvio Micali, Oded Goldreich, and Avi Vigderson, where they showed how to prove that a prover can prove to a verifier that a graph is three-colorable, and that's an NP-complete problem. And it follows from this is that you can actually show any NP statement in zero knowledge. So I can prove to you any statement that has a short proof in such a way that at the end you'll believe the statement, but you will have no idea of the proof. In order to do that, they introduced computational assumptions. So this was under the assumption that one-way functions exist. What this means, okay, going a little bit into the field, is that essentially we can take now any protocol between, let's say, multiple people, not just two, let's say n people, where there's a program, say, that specifies what messages I'm supposed to send to Alon and what messages Alon is sent to a third party and so forth, okay? And the thing is that the messages that I'm supposed to send are based, let's say, on my passwords or some private information I have. The messages you're supposed to send are based on what you received from me and your private information. And I don't, so I do my computation, I send the message. So if we're all honest, everything's fine. But suppose I'm a liar. I'm an adversary. We're in a cryptographic setting. We're all liars in some sense, or we have to protect ourselves in any case. And how do you know I'm sending the right message? How do you know I did the computation correctly based on all, based in this current time, based on my private information and all the messages I received, the next message I sent is correct? Well, that's an NP statement, right? So there's a statement to prove, and that is that I'm sending the correct statement. And if I can prove that in zero knowledge, it means that I can actually transform all protocols that work when people behave properly to protocols that work when people behave improperly. Because essentially every message I send is accompanied with a proof that that is the correct message, and it's a zero knowledge proof. So I'm not revealing anything about my secrets.
What about other applications?
Lots of other applications. So the next application is something called multi-party computation, so which is a little related to what I just said, but it's actually much more relevant to today. So let's talk about the fact that we are now living in this data-driven society, and there's different parties, might be different hospitals or different national agencies, and they have a lot of data. So if you think about hospitals, it could be one hospital has my genomic information, another hospital has my blood type, my blood test over the years, another hospital might know something about illnesses that I have experienced, and they would like to share, they would like to compute something based on this data, but they don't want to reveal to each other the data. Another example might be that I am the tax authorities and you are the immigration office and somebody else is, I don't know, other governmental agency. And because of regulations, they're not allowed to share the information. Still, they would like to compute some function that's based on all of the data together. That's what we call multi-party computation. There's multiple parties, each one has data, which is confidential, and they want to compute some function that depends on all the data without revealing it to each other. So it turns out that it can be done. And it can be done partially, there's a lot of algebra involved, it's beautiful theory, but what does zero knowledge have to do with it? So if everybody's honest, it can be done. It's an interesting method of how, but what if somebody is not honest? Maybe they're not following the protocol. Well, you just tag on zero knowledge to each one of their messages, and then even if they're potentially dishonest, you will be guaranteed correctness because they will be caught if they deviate from the protocol.
Did you foresee the generality of the method at the time?
No.
Nothing.
It's way,
again, you were
way beyond its time. I mean,
and again, what was the reaction back then?
About multi-party computation?
Yeah, to these new revolutionary ideas.
So first, there was a paper by Goldwasser and Vigderson who did this multi-party computation based on the existence of one-way function. And that got in. I think it had a strong reaction, I mean good reaction. But then there was a follow-up paper that is by myself, Miki Benor, and Avi Vigderson, which happened at a time that I was visiting Hebrew University in sabbatical, and that did not have computational assumptions. So, there's sort of a partition of a crowd within, I think, theoretical computer science, and maybe less so these days. Some of them are so intrigued by the concept and are willing to make assumptions like the existence of one-way function or that it's hard to factor integers and so forth. Some that discounts results for them. So when you can prove an information theoretic result without assumption, they're happier. So I think that the fact that there were information theoretic analogs was very helpful for this whole theory to be adopted.
Okay, before we move on, I'd like to ask more about applications.
Okay.
Digital signatures, Fiat Shamir you mentioned.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to talk about that?
Actually, I want to say something more about zero knowledge.
Okay.
So we've mentioned like this. First of all, it's intellectually curious. Then Adi, Fiat and Shamir realized this is important for identity theft. Next step was that this enabled a conversion of protocols from honest parties to potentially misbehaving parties. But then all of a sudden, in recent years, it had some very unusual usages. One of them was by some researchers in Princeton, together with Boaz Barak, where they talked about the use of zero knowledge for nuclear disarmament. Now it sounds like, out of nowhere. The idea there is that you want to be able, let's say the Russians and the Americans want to make sure that they're disarming nuclear warheads, but they don't want to show each other the technology. So how do you prove that a nuclear warhead is in fact a nuclear warhead without looking inside? It sounds like you want to prove a statement, but give zero knowledge. And it's not just by association. There's actually a concrete method that they use, which uses a lot of underlying principles from the mathematics of zero knowledge. Another example, which Moni Noor from Weizmann came up with, is suppose you are a suspect in a crime and you want to prove that you did not commit it. So they are asking you to give some DNA so that they can compare it to the forensic. And the point is you don't want to give it because maybe you are planning on doing a crime in the future or your children are. So how do you prove that you were not in the crime scene or your DNA does not match in zero knowledge without actually giving the DNA? So there's all these applications from all over the place. And the last application is the blockchains. So today, as you know, there's this whole idea of Bitcoin, blockchains, how do we put transactions out on a blockchain so that they are serialized in time? And some of the questions are, okay, so you want to put transactions, or transactions mean things you've done. You want to have records that everybody can see. But sometimes you don't want everybody to know the details of the records. You might want to prove that two records are the same, or other properties of the records, and you want to do that in zero knowledge. So it has actually become very well known to people in the trade these days, and there are even companies that specialize in zero knowledge.
And also digital signatures.
Yes, digital signatures. Yes. So what are you asking about that?
So Fiat Shamir,
Yeah.
The standards of digital signatures over the web is based on ideas going back to zero knowledge, the ones that started in the late 80s.
So digital signatures were invented, as I said, in Diffie-Hellman's paper. Then RSA had an implementation, but there wasn't really no definition of security. So it was obvious that you don't want it, a digital signature should be secure, it shouldn't be forgeable. But then we came up with this definition for what does that really mean. So what would that mean? Let's say someone's a notary public, so they're able to sign. You want to make sure that even though you can go to the notary public and give them documents at will for them to sign, that you're not able to learn how they sign and be able to sign a document in the future. This is what we call digital signature secure against chosen message attack. So in other words, I can choose the documents that I feed the notary public to sign, and yet, even though I see a polynomial number of signatures, I'm not able to produce yet one more document for which I sign it without the help of the notary public.
And you came up with the first definition of what
Definition
it means.
and construction, we had a way to do it.
And then eventually it became crucial to the development of electronic commerce over the internet.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to information theoretic, non-conditional results.
Yeah.
Maybe first we talk about geographically. Where are you located now?
So this is 1986. And actually we should talk about primality then before.
Right, so let's talk first about primality.
Yeah. Okay, so as I told you, interactive proofs, or maybe I didn't mention it, but we were talking about the fact there's a proven, there's a verifier, the verifier is tossing coins, they go back and forth. The big distinction of interactive proofs from classical proofs is that there is a probability of error. So I proved to you something, and with very, very high probability, you know it's correct. Or another way to say that, there's a very small probability that I managed to cheat and prove an incorrect statement. That's what enables zero knowledge. So, as I told you, I was always interested in number theory. And there was this problem around, which is how do you test numbers for being prime? And a beautiful old result by Miller and Rabin, Solvay and Strassen is an algorithm for testing numbers whether they're primes or not, a fast algorithm that has a probability of error. So at the end, you run this algorithm, you know with very good probability that your number is prime. In fact, what it is that if it's composite, you are likely to detect that it's composite. And if you don't detect it's composite, you say it's probably prime. So an interesting question was, can you have a primality test, okay, that doesn't have any probability of error? So can we test that a number is prime or composite and be 100% correct? And can you do that without actually factoring the number? And that was work that I really enjoyed tremendously and did with my graduate student, Joe Killian, at the time.
It was your first graduate, or was it?
Joe? No, Johan Aston was my
Aston?
first, yeah.
And you want to tell us more a bit
About the story?
The story?
Yeah, so I was in a conference again. As I told you, sitting in lectures really works well for me. So I was in a conference in Arcadia. There was some conference center there. And Scove gave a talk, René Scove gave a talk about some algorithm he had for taking square roots mod p for small numbers. And it had something to do with elliptic curves over finite fields, and which is something I knew nothing about, but he described what an elliptic curve was, and he had some algorithm for counting how many points are on a curve. And this whole elliptic curve was defined with respect to a prime. So there was some equation, you know, y cubed, whatever. Y squared is equal to x cubed plus ax plus b mod p, and you could count the number of solutions yx. And this defined a group, and he was doing some operations on the group. In any case, he had an algorithm. And when I was sitting in this lecture, I started thinking to myself, what if you would run this algorithm, but you mod p, except you didn't know whether p was a prime or composite? How would the algorithm perform? Would it work? Would it not work? And I asked him that question. And I think it sounded like a really weird question. And he was like, well, it probably would be garbage if you ran it mod a p where p was composite. So then I went back to Cambridge, and I think I invited Scove to come and give the talk at MIT. And he came and he gave the talk again, so I understood a bit more. And then I started talking to Joe about the question of what if this prime was a composite, and we started talking about how to use these elliptic curves, working mod and modulus, which we are trying to tell whether it's a prime or composite. And then the rest is history. We had a primality test based on elliptic curves, where at the end it was randomized, but there was no error probability.
That was in 86?
That was in 86, yeah.
Okay, and then what?
Then what? So then it was 86 or 87, and I haven't been in Israel for many years. I used to come visit, but I was like really pining away in some sense to be in Israel for some extended period of time. And I had a sabbatical, and I decided to spend it in Israel. So when I came to visit the Hebrew University, that was in 1987. It was a incredible visit because I haven't been in Israel for a long time prior, and it was incredible personally because I met my husband here, Nir Shavit, and he was incredible scientifically, as I have described to you. And I came to the Hebrew University, and there was Avi Vigderson and Nati Linyal and Benny and Michael Benor. And I didn't know what I was going to work on. I was teaching a course about primality and elliptic curves, and they were very excited because, elliptic curves were creatures that they didn't use in computer science. They haven't been used that much either since, but in any case, I was teaching this class, and then I remember that I was in Avi's office, and they asked me this question. It says, what else is there to do with in cryptography? Because we've already done encryption, and we had like good definitions and signatures and identification schemes and zero knowledge, and what else is there? So this is a question for some reason people ask many times, many years later. And at that time, sort of under the pressure of the moment, which is always very good for me to be asked questions under the pressure of the moment. It's an aspect. It was like, well, we make assumptions, and maybe we could make some sort of physical assumptions rather than computational assumptions like that factoring is hard. And we could prove results absolutely. And somehow that conversation led to two different papers. One of them was, when I told you about interactive proofs, I told you there was that result that said that you can actually prove any statement in zero knowledge using an interactive proof if one-way functions exist, if factoring is hard. And that's a conditional result, right? So one question is, can you do it without any assumptions? Well, what we came up with at the time, and this was with Joe Killian also, was this model where there wasn't a single prover and a single verifier, but there were two provers. Now that sounds weird, like why two? Anyway, this prover is supposedly very powerful. Why does he need another powerful friend? So there was this idea was the following, that these two provers, they're like committing a crime. What's the crime? The crime is that they're trying to convince you of an incorrect theorem. And just like the police is like the verifier. It's interrogating these provers. And in order to check that their alibi holds up, they put them in separate rooms. They ask some questions from one, potential criminal, and then they go and they ask and they compare questions to the other potential criminal. And this defines a model. What's the model? We have two provers. We have one verifier. The verifier can ask questions from each one depending on the question they ask the other. And the restriction on the two of them is they can't speak to each other. That's a new definition of a proof system. We still want the fact that only correct statements should be convinced. There should be proofs only for correct statement. There shouldn't be proofs, no matter what these two guys do, for incorrect statement. But now we have an assumption. Except it's not that factoring is hard, but that these two guys are disjoint from each other. And of course, I had some idea that it's not so bizarre because we can think of an ID cards, because I was thinking about Adi's motivation, that instead of having one ID card, you'd have two of them, and you put them into a bank machine. There were already bank machines at that point, which might not sound interesting to you, but ATMs are also an invention that occurred during that time.
I'm not that young.
You're not that young, okay. Neither one of us. In any case, so there are two cards, and you think about those two cards as two provers that are proving that they're Shafi, and the ATM is the verifier, and you could like make noise so they can't talk to each other. They can't see what questions are being asked. We had a patent on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe we can actually go down the line with this line of research, and then we'll go back to the other paper, and all the chain of implication is very interesting, I think. So maybe...
Right. So in any case, so we had this model, the two provers. Why did we invent this model? Because it turned out that you could prove that every theorem that has a short statement has also a short proof, has also an interactive proof or a multi-prover interactive proof, where these two guys, they are separate rooms, and they're going to convince the verifier of the correctness of the statement without giving him the proof in zero knowledge, no assumptions. Okay, so there was a system. We did it for zero knowledge in order to remove the assumptions like factoring is hard. And then there was a paper by, I think, Fortnow, Rumpel, and Sipser, where they showed that you don't, what was it? That how many rounds you needed for this two-prover system. And then a whole bunch of results started to follow. And then there was this incredible result, okay, by Noam Nissan, who was a postdoc at the time at MIT. And what he showed was you can, with two-prover system, prove the value of a permanent to a verifier. Now, I don't want to get into the technical definition, but this is a very, very hard problem. It is it's beyond NP. And all of a sudden, it seemed like, and additionally, it's a complete problem for counting sharp P class, and it seems like the two provers were extremely powerful. And what followed after that is that using the techniques that Noam used, within sort of a whirlwind of results, it has been shown that this class of interactive proofs with a single prover was as powerful as polynomial space. And then again, within months or weeks, it was shown that this class of two-prover interactive proofs was as powerful as non-deterministic exponential time. And all of a sudden, these weird creatures that we've introduced with provers and verifiers, interactions, and people locked in different rooms, were sort of grounded in the traditional complexity theory, with classes like polynomial space and non-deterministic exponential time, and equivalences were shown.
And how did you feel at that time?
What, the fact that all of a sudden...
But yourself, your contribution?
I thought it was, first of all, the mathematics was fantastic. It was really new material. It was arithmetization of polynomials, how to, express languages. So the math was fascinating, and I thought that...
you were pleased?
I was pleased. Yes, I was very pleased.
Okay, let's continue on that line and then we'll rewind
Sure.
back. So then you had the result, you went to Dimax?
Yeah, then I had a couple years later, I think it's like 1990, I was in Princeton for sabbatical, and I think Joe Killian gave a talk there about something about, I can't remember anymore, some two-prover proof system and non-deterministic exponential time. And there was something about his talk that made me think that you could sort of simulate non-deterministic, you could do all non-deterministic exponential time in exponential time, which, like, you know, you would show a collapse of these deterministic and non-deterministic classes. And I told Muli Safra about that, who was actually my postdoc at the time, I think, and he was also in Princeton. We started talking about it, and then it turned out that that would be true if, now it seems like a rabbit out of a hat, if some graph theoretic problem was easy to approximate. And the graph theoretic problem is called the clique problem. It's like you have a graph and you would like to find a subset of the graph which all edges, where all vertices have edges between them. And it turned out that if you could approximate the size of the largest clique in a graph, then you could have showed that non-deterministic exponential time was equal to exponential time. Turning this on its head, it says that it's hard to approximate the size of the largest clique in a graph if non-deterministic exponential time is not equal to exponential time. And then when you sort of downsize this, you get essentially a result that says that it's hard to approximate clique if P is different than NP. So there's an NP hardness result hiding in there.
So you sort of started with complexity, went to cryptography, and came back.
Yeah. And this whole idea of using multi-prover interactive proofs, something that then morphed to something called probabilistically checkable proofs, PCPs, started with that work. And how to use that in order to prove hardness of approximation started with that work. And that's become a complete field. Okay. That I'm very proud of.
Rightfully so. Okay, so now you want to continue a bit on this thread or go back to the other paper with the...
So let me just say a few things about this.
Okay.
So we've talked about interactive proofs, right? Single prover and verifier. We've talked about this multi-prover interactive proof. What is this probabilistically checkable proof? So far everything was just very general, right? There's these two provers, there's a verifier, they exchange messages. At the end, the verifier accepts the proof, doesn't accept the proof, there's some probability of error. But now we start quantifying things a bit. So you can talk about how much randomness is the verifier using? How many coins does it have to toss? You can talk about the length of the messages that are being sent. You can talk about how many questions are being asked. You can talk about the probability of error. And once you start quantifying this, it turns out that the value of these are parameters. And if you change these parameters, they can be sort of very tightly coupled to the problems that you can either approximate or non-approximate. But let me say it in a different way. There's this third creature, which I mentioned, probabilistically checkable proof. What is that? So there the idea is much easier to understand. In a sense, doesn't require the stories of provers and verifiers and so forth. Even though I love stories, and I never would have gotten to any of this without stories. So probabilistically checkable proof, the idea is the following. Usually people think of proofs, mathematicians think of proof as a string that you can read in a book, right? It starts from statement 1, statements follow, QED. A probabilistically checkable proof is a way to write a proof in such a way that you can actually, you don't have to read the entire proof. You can probe it at some locations, not in all of them. And you should think of it as if I'm choosing these locations at random, and make some check on those locations you've probed, some local checks. And if there is a mistake in the original proof, there's a very good chance you'll find a mistake in the local check. So it's these proofs which are probabilistically checkable because you're sort of choosing the locations at random. And furthermore, you have to read a lot less than reading the entire proof. Of course, you don't get certainty, you get probability of success. And now the kind of parameters that I talked about a minute ago come into play. How many places in the proof do you have to look at? What is the probability of error? What are the sizes of the questions and answers? And these are parameters that in the original paper that I had with Muli and then with Lovas and Fege, we joined forces, these parameters were improved subsequently by work by Aurora and Safra, and then by some well-known paper by Aurora, Lun, Matwani, Segedi, and Safra, to be sort of optimal, where you really need just log in randomness and look at constant number of bits of the proof, and you will catch a mistake if it exists.
Segedi and Sudan.
What?
Segedi and Sudan.
Segedi and Sudan.
Yeah. PCP.
Yes.
You describe PCPs, and now you want to let's rewind back to the late 80s, to the second result you were alluding to.
Right. So that's a result with Benor and Avi. And that's about how to do multi-party computation, the same problem I told you about with the different hospitals that I want to compute, let's say. And it's a beautiful result, which shows how to essentially turn this into an algebraic problem, where the data that you have is represented as essentially shares of a polynomial. And this is something actually is called secret sharing, that was invented by Adi Shamir, is how to take a piece of data and share it among n people, so that only, looking at some of the shares, you have no idea what the data is, but if you have sufficient number of shares, you can reconstruct it. But Adi's secret sharing just was a way to share data. What we were asking is, how do you compute on data? So now we have these 3 hospitals, and let's say each one of them has shared their data, secret shared among all 3. And but that's not enough. They want to do a computation on it. Like they want to do maybe some linear regression, or they want to find out how many patients are there whose DNA is of a specific type and have had infections in the past, and their blood test is in a certain range. Okay, so they want to do maybe set intersection or something like that. You can write any such function as essentially a sequence of operations on the data, which essentially looks like I'm not going to explain how, but essentially looks like summing and multiplying. And what we realize is how you can take these secret shares, which were essentially values of polynomials, and compute with them. How can you add them and how can you multiply them, where I only have my shares. I have shares of your data, I have shares of everybody else's data, and using these shares I can essentially compute a share of the sum of the data, a share of the product of the data. I can keep doing this iteratively, and the end result is that essentially any program that we want to run on this data can be run in such a way that at the end I will only have a share of the result, and I will have learned nothing about the data except for that share of the result. And since all of us have shares of the result, now we can reconstruct the result. So that means that I knew with my input, I'm going to know the result, and I could tell whatever is implied by knowing my input and the result, and nothing else. And it's important. Yeah.
Why is it important?
Again, for lots and lots of application these days. So if you want to connect it, if we kind of zoom to 2017, all the rave now is machine learning, right? Everybody's talking about these neural nets and logistic regression and how it is going to change our lives. For medical, for actionable medicine, right? Precision medicine, for targeting consumers, for making decisions on who to set on bail, and so forth. But there is a question, and that is that a lot of this is driven by the fact that we have tons and tons of data about people, and this data sometimes should not be shared, and it's held, let's say, by either individuals or by entities that even are bound by regulation not to share it. So how are you going to get them to share their data, to be used, let's say, by a machine learning algorithm in such a way that still respects the privacy of individuals? And the technique of multi-party computation is essential for that, because you may think of coming up with a machine learning algorithm, let's say in the training phase, taking the data, training on it, and figuring out a model that can do predictions as a protocol, which has access to data toward the end of coming up with a prediction algorithm, but not foreseeing the data explicitly. And multi-party computation, because of its generality, can be used to it. Now, there's a difference here between theory and practice. On paper, all's good. That is, we wrote papers and we proved theorems. But in order to use it in practice, in a way that's efficient enough you need to do a lot of optimization, you need to improve, you need to implement, and only time will tell if these methods will be used as they are or they will be modified, and hopefully not to modify to such an extent that they will be insecure.
Well, they are already being deployed in commercial contexts.
Yes.
So. Okay, I'd like to switch gears for a moment now and go back to the personal, from the scientific to the personal.
Okay.
Maybe you can guide us through your experience from a personal perspective.
Sure. So we were at MIT, right? And there was this exciting time of being an assistant professor. And then all these results happened. And then I came to Israel and had that sabbatical, which were more kind of interesting breakthroughs. And on a personal level, I was getting older. I got married with a guy that I met in Israel. and I had 2 children, Yonadav and Lior. And they are 5.5 years apart. They are incredible, each one in its own way. And being a parent is different than being a scientist. It's all-consuming. And, the well-being of these children is everything. It becomes everything. And being able to balance that with being quite driven, having this job in MIT, and at that, we haven't talked about that, but after I got married, I also decided to spend some of my time in Israel, and I got a job in the Weizmann Institute, which was a wonderful place with wonderful colleagues. It is a wonderful place with wonderful colleagues, incredible powerhouse. But having children and having these sort of dual homes academically meant that we lived our life in a certain way, where the kids we all spent some few years in Israel, then a few years in Boston, and then in Israel and in Boston. And it's true that a lot of academics go on sabbaticals, they go on leaves, the children travel all over the world. In our case, it was maybe more planned. So I think a lot of academics, every 4 years, they go someplace. But we really knew that every 3-4 years, we get up and go. The good side was that we always went to the same place, and the kids had the same schools. But the fact that it was kind of a predestined departure gave an alternative structure to our life, which I think is unique. Is probably a lot of people watching this, if anybody's watching it, know that being a parent is associated with a lot of responsibility and a lot of guilt. And I have plenty of it. But you know what? They came out pretty good.
In hindsight, would you do...
Would you do it all over again?
Yeah.
That's a great question, right? I think I would do my scientific career all over again in the same way. Would I have done this back and forth thing? I don't think hindsight is something that we can actually act on, is it? And therefore,
Definitely
it's
not.
Pointless.
Okay.
At any point in time, it didn't seem like there was any choice except to do what we did.
No point in regretting anything.
It's just, it was so compelling, I think everything in my life has always been sort of unavoidable, in the sense that I was so compelled to do it that I couldn't see it from the outside. I could only see it from the inside.
You have other examples of this phenomenon?
Of seeing things only from the inside?
Of being compelled to do something and...
Yeah, I guess I'm about to embark on a new adventure. So as I told you, I've been at MIT, I've been in Weizmann for many years, I've done this back and forth, I've had my children, I've had my career, I've had my marriage life, I've taken care of my parents for many years. All of these things are things one compelled to do. And in the last year, I've decided to go back to Berkeley to head an institute for theoretical computer science, or foundations of computer science. And I think that I've kind of experienced the same compelling compellment. I've experienced the same type of, I've experienced the same kind of internal drive or internal push toward a decision, which may look in hindsight a bit surprising, because I have a fabulous job at MIT and a fabulous job at Weizmann. And I've already have a full life, right? And all of a sudden there's a third thing that's thrown into the wrench. But I feel compelled to do it.
You long to recreate the Berkeley days?
Maybe, you know, those green hills and that beautiful
blue sky.
Blue sky. There's something to that.
Okay, is there something you want to add in this context?
No, I'm looking forward to a new adventure.
You were talking about this duality, Weizmann, MIT,
Yes.
this back and forth.
Yes.
Would you be able to compare the two places in terms of culture, in terms of differences?
Yes. So MIT is very intense. There's a lot of people, a lot of graduate students. You know, I have right now 8 graduate students at MIT and a lot of postdocs and colleagues. And there's continuous seminars and meetings, and you really feel like you're in the midst of it. And Weizmann has fantastic faculty members, very, very good graduate students, but fewer. And the doors are sometimes more closed than open, even though it's changed, I think, in the last years. So there's more time to think, but there's less intensity. And I think that they're very different that way. And it's hard to tell what's right for which person. And for me, I know that both have been beneficial, but in a different way. So I think that after a few years in Weizmann, I was very eager to go back to MIT. And after a few years at MIT, I was very, very eager to rest a little bit and just kind of be able to think. And now I have no idea what it's going to be like at Berkeley. Maybe I could both think and be intense. And maybe I'll just have a completely new experience.
And has it always been so intense in MIT? Invariably through the years?
I think so. I mean, you know, there are years where sort of cryptography specifically has gone through a lot of revolutions. So there was a time that I described in the 80s and in the 90s. Then there was a time that was quieter. There was this beginning of lattice-based cryptography, which I was also a little bit of a pioneer at. And there were fewer people who were working on it because it's harder material. But now we are getting in the midst of a big revolution, which is talking about these new methods of encryption, where not only you encrypt, but you can actually compute on encryption, called homomorphic encryption. And there's things called program obfuscation. And there's many, many people in the field, and they are often working on similar problems. So there's a lot of conflicts in the sense that people are submitting the same results to the conference, and then they merge them or they unmerge them. It's a very different pace.
And that's something you mentioned before, that you feel uncomfortable with working on the same problem that everybody's working on.
I'm not sure I can really compete when everybody's working on the same problem. I think my strength is more at sort of defining the problems, maybe defining, sort of coming up with an original idea or method, proving the first results. When it already becomes so well known that a lot of people are working on it, I don't think that I am so fast and so technically alert that I could derive the pleasure or even derive the outcome.
Okay. Now I'd like to ask you about some retrospective about advising students throughout the years.
Sure.
Because you've had many great students, well-known, very successful, and in several waves, in several generations.
That's right.
So.
All right. So first of all, I have had incredible students. And these students, I'm thankful for that every day. You know, early in my career, I worked with my colleagues. You know, I worked with Sylvia and Oded and Avi and others. So I never really wrote papers with my students. But now I do. But in any case, invariably, first the students were really more doing their own thing, and I was advising them in the sense that they would tell me about their stuff. And sometimes questions came from me, sometimes questions came from them. Now it's more, you know, that I'm in an advisory role, that most of the questions come from me, but the students do a lot of the work. I think that my advising style must have changed because it became much more, you know, working together with the students than it was before. I'm always at awe at the fact that there's a new student and there's a new talent, and that they really make something out of nothing. Not in the sense that they are nothing, in the sense that they come up with new ideas and new questions. And where does it come from? That's the incredible thing of working in a university. There's this young generation, one after the other, and they are so excited about what they do, and they are remarkable. So that's really a gift of being able to be in a university.
Okay. Can you mention different styles of students, of researchers that you encountered, different characters?
Different characters. I've met lots of characters. I remember Joe Killian was really into limericks and great sense of humor and a very creative, unusual researcher. And then there are people who are very technically extremely sharp. I mean, so was Joe, like Johan. And I'm mentioning the people in the beginning because at my advanced age, it's easy to remember the past rather than the present. No, but I've had amazing students, really, all along. Some of my students are faculty members at Weizmann, where we're sitting right now, like Zvika Barkersky and Guy Rothblum, who've both done amazing things. And then some of my students are faculty members at MIT, like Vinod Kuntanathan. Then there's Yael Kalai. And I have students all over Israel, who are like Ishai Mansour, Nadia Kavya, and many others, and all over the world.
So now we can leisurely talk about property testing and delegation.
Sure. Okay, so property testing.
How did it all start?
How did it all start? So I actually think that my first thoughts in the direction of property testing come again to a talk that I attended in Hebrew University of Michael Kearns, actually, where he talked about learning. He had some model of statistical query learning. In any case, and then I drove back with him to Tel Aviv, and we had some conversation in the car that made me start thinking about the question of not learning, where you're trying to essentially you have examples and you're trying to predict, a label of a future example, but more being able to tell a property of whether the examples you're seeing belong to one distribution or another distribution. Or another way to say about it, what do I mean by examples? That's too generic. So let's say that you have a function, and you can't look at the function table. You actually don't have a description of the function, but you can query the function in different places. And what you'd like to find out is a property of this function. So what could be an example of a function? An example of a function could be, let's say there's a graph, and I actually can't look at the whole graph because the graph might be extremely large. But what I have is I could apply a function to two vertices, and the function will say 1 if there's an edge between them and 0 otherwise. So that's the description of the graph. It says a function. So there's sort of an indirect description. And now I'd like to ask questions about this graph. Is this graph three-colorable? Is this graph connected? Can this graph be partitioned into two sets of vertices, that there's only edges going between the sets and not between vertices within the two sets? It's called a bipartite graph. So that's a property, okay? And obviously, some of these questions, you have to look at the entire graph. So you have to sort of ask the function, the entire function table for every pair of vertices, what the edge is, and then solve the problem. So then property testing, though, says, you know what? Let's relax the question. Because we really cannot write down the whole graph. We cannot query the function in all places. We'd like to tell whether the graph that's being described by this function, which I can sort of query, is close to a graph that has that property. So if we think, let's look at a specific graph property. Let's say connected. So this graph that the function is describing, it's either connected or it's far from being connected. What do I mean by far being connected? It means that if you look at the closest graph to it by removing edges or adding edges, let's say it's epsilon apart. You have to add epsilon or subtract epsilon edges. And I'm talking about epsilon rather than, because I'm normalizing here. So there's a fraction of edges that you have to insert or delete. And I'd like to tell which is the case. Is it a connected graph or is it far from a connected graph? And I'd like to do that by querying the function in very few places. So for the layman, let's think of it this way. We're not living in the age of dinosaurs anymore, right? So we find, bones of dinosaurs. Can we, just by looking at bones of dinosaurs, tell whether the entire dinosaurs was a Rhinoceros? Was it a meat eater or herbivore? Apparently, people make conjectures based on very little data. So the question here is, if I can only look at very little places in the graph, either given or I can query the graph at places of my choice, can I tell something about the graph more globally, like being connected or being far from connected? So this is the way I like to describe property testing, and that's a field that, paper together with Oded Goldreich and Dan Aron, we wrote on testing properties of graphs, and more generally testing properties of natural structures. Graphs is a natural structure, or other functions are possible too, not just to describe graphs. And we would like to find out whether a function, let's say, is monotone, and we can't write down the whole function table. We can just query the function in a few places. Can you tell if it's monotone or far from monotone? This is a field that's become a whole field. I mean, that paper, I think, was fairly influential. And then you asked me about delegation.
And lattices. If you want to mention some more about lattices.
You're going to mix this in, I assume.
I'm not going to do anything, but maybe, yeah, with their help.
Yeah. I think I'll talk about delegation.
Okay.
So, time moves on, and people start talking about different models of computation, like cloud computing. And the idea of cloud computing is that there are these computers out there, and I'm a client, and I'd like to use the computers, and they will do all the computation for me and then give me the results. So a clear question is, how do I know they're even computing it correctly? I'm delegating my computation to an outside computer. I want to get some proof that the result has been correctly computed. And we call this a delegation problem. And that's a problem that is a little bit similar to interactive proofs, because this computer proves a statement to me, and the statement is that it did the computation correctly. And that's been a problem that I've been very interested in. And the delegation paradigm isn't just delegating computation, but you can think about it in other contexts, like you want to delegate in the context of error correcting codes. So let's say I want to code a message in such a way that even if there's noise on the line, you can detect it. Then there's a question of how much work does you have to invest in order to encode, and how much work do you have to invest into decode. And you can talk about delegating work of the encoder to the decoder, or vice versa. So this whole delegation paradigm is something that I've been interested in the last, 15 years already, and that's been fascinating. And this is work with my students, Yael Kalai and Guy Rothblum. So that's something that I'm still interested in. I think that this delegation paradigm is very powerful in today's sort of modern computational world. And you asked about lattices. So as I mentioned, the theory of lattices has become the basis in hard problems on lattices. Like if you define some sort of integer lattice via basis, find the short vector in a lattice, has become sort of this theory, and these hard problems have become the basis of what we call post-quantum cryptography. And implementing sort of essentially cryptographic primitive based on these type of problems is a fascinating field which I've been involved in.
And you were very, very early on.
This was work with Oded Goldreich, where we sort of asked this question of interactive proofs to show that a shortest vector in a lattice is not so short, and we introduced some new methods in this field.
You actually introduced a method to show that it's going to be it's unlikely to be as hard as other approximations.
Yeah, but in any case, the method is more important than actually the result, because the method is essentially what underlines a lot of proofs of security in modern cryptographic systems that are based on this post-quantum cryptography.
Okay.
And I want to mention actually one more student. So Daniele Miciancio, who was one of my students, which I love very much, he started working on logic with Albert Meyer's masters. Then he came and worked with me about digital signatures. And for his exam, there are these exams at MIT which don't exist anymore, where you're supposed to give a student a few papers, and then they are supposed to read it and do some original contribution within 3 weeks. So I gave him some papers on lattices, and he came up with some beautiful new result, proving the hardness of approximation of shortest vector in a lattice, and that became his field of research. And I feel privileged to have suggested the problem to him, or the papers to him. So I think he's one of the sort of guiding lights in the field of lattice-based cryptography.
Okay. You want to mention something more about students?
I think that I have a new crop of students, which are wonderful, and they're doing, today it's actually interesting that a lot of the students are not only interested in sort of the science, but they're actually interested also in the impact on society. So this is sort of a modern wave. I mean, as you see people, there is this generation that's just interested in going to startups, and the generation that's just interested in doing complexity theory, and then doing cryptography. And the new generation, that I have at least, they're very interested in the impact of the methods on today's world. And when I say impact, I don't mean just implementing systems that are run efficiently, but really questions of like how is this going to change the world from a society point of view?
So for them, the application might be more of a guideline?
The application might be more of a guideline, but it's not an application that is necessarily only having to do with utility, but it actually also has to do with doing good. I mean, privacy anyway is doing good in my book, but it's beyond that.
What's your take on privacy? Whether it's doing good, whether it helps?
Of course it's doing good. I mean, it's the usual line that I think they attribute to Judge Brandeis, but I think it was Brandeis and his another lawyer, that they were in a law firm together, and this is after the original cameras were invented, the kind of cameras, portable cameras that you could take out of the camera shop. And they wrote this paper about what about the right to be left alone. It's very nice that you can take photographs, but now I could be taking a photograph without my permission. Now imagine where we are at, right? Everything we do on our iPhone, every Google query we make, every email we send is being recorded by these big giant companies, and they're deriving conclusions from it, like giving us advertising for us. So the right to be left alone is something nobody imagines anymore, with all the sensors and the cameras. And it really alters our reality, and I think we need to think about it.
And you don't think it's too late by now to do anything about it?
It's just like talking about the environment, right? So we have a lot of pollution, but somehow it's self-regulating, not as well as it should be, but there are climate agreements, and people don't sell the kind of cars they used to. There's emission controls. So my feeling is that every revolution has, at some point, people realize that there are some things to fix. And I don't see why the lack of privacy is not going to be the same. Because the methods exist, and we can develop more methods, but people have to be aware, people have to kind of pull back, people have to implement these methods on top of the existing ability to spy or to have sensors.
And what about the negative implications of the ability to encrypt data and hide it from others?
The negative implications?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess the negative implications is that, we could go dark, right? This idea that now that the encryption methods are being developed and they're so strong and they're so well known that we won't be able to pursue criminals, right? So being able to read messages, being able to wiretap, being able to listen to digital communication is a police tool. It is a national security tool. We all know there's more and more threats. So by enabling this encryption for the public, you are, in a sense, making it more difficult for law enforcement to behave. I buy it, but it's a very thin line, right? So on one hand, privacy has so many good outcomes. It's enabled electronic commerce. It's enabled the use of remote computers for delegating computation. It's going to enable doing machine learning on data while keeping it private. On the other hand, there are these criminals who should be caught, and we should enable law enforcement to catch them. How do you reconcile the two? One opinion is that you just say, well, tough, let the law enforcement figure out other methods to catch criminals and don't give up on privacy. And another point of view, which is the other extreme, is let the law enforcement have all the keys to all the encryption algorithms out there. And maybe there's a third, sort of economic model where you sort of think of cost and benefit analysis and you're able to trade it off. So you can sort of trade off privacy and policing. I don't think people have looked at it, but just, again, if we go back to the example of environmental science, there is sort of a cost-benefit analysis of putting regulations. And there are resources that are renewable, resources that are not renewable, and there's, measures. So this is not really my expertise, but I can imagine a world where that kind of theory is developed also with respect to privacy.
What about the future?
That's the thing about the future. You don't know, do you? As we say in Hebrew, yetov. No, you're asking about the scientific future.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. The future is that I'd love to continue doing research. I love interacting with young people, with postdocs, with graduate students. I'm still inventing new questions. We haven't talked about them, but that might be in another interview. And I still get excited from new questions and new answers. I'm looking at what has happened to cryptography. It's kind of amazing in terms of the number of people and the impact and the excitement. So this is sort of a future which is inevitable. It's not sort of, there's no question that cryptography has a future. And personally, I hope to do more. I hope the field will do more. I'm very optimistic.
Where do you see yourself 5 years from now?
You know what? I think that's the one question I can't answer. I don't know.
In terms of aspirations,
I want to keep on working. I want to keep on creating. I want to have ideas. I want to have impact. And the kind of impact that I'm talking about now is also impact as, let's say, the director of the Simons Institute, or someone who directs, someone has some influence about where the field is going, in the sense of what's important, what's not important. I think that I've had a good hunch, and I feel I have an intuition to serve me, and also a lot of experience. So if I have made impact in the next 5 years, both in terms of research and in terms of leadership, if my kids do well and they're happy, then I will be very happy in 5 years.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shafi.
Okay, thank you.